Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, the Luffy fanfics. Back with amazing fanfiction. This is the series of What if Zoro becomes Mihawk's child? Now before starting, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. Pointless didn't begin to describe this trip. The lab had been abandoned for what looked like years, dust covering every surface he saw. A few scraps of paper littered the floor, destroyed equipment lining the walls. There was someone still in the lab, Mihawk could sense them. But the person was weak, barely alive. Most likely a pirate or some other criminal that found the base and hoped it would be the perfect place to hide from the world government. It wasn't. Mihawk scanned the building as he moved, searching for a way down to the weakling floors below him. Any marine recruit could have done this. Why they insisted on sending Mihawk, he couldn't fathom. Or, rather he could. The world government loved to remind him that he had made an agreement and they could ask him to go anywhere at any time. It was very bothersome, but also not overly common. The number of times he had to run errands for the government paled in comparison to the number of naps bounty hunters and marine vessels interrupted. The switch to the lower floors proved impossible to find. Mihawk shouldn't be surprised. Vegapunk was considered a genius for a reason. But even genius couldn't defend against everything. A single swipe of Euro's blade cracked the floor, cement splitting down to the foundation. In the distance, Mihawk makes out a whimper. Sliding Euro back into its place, he frowns down at the hole in the floor. So, not only is whoever's hiding a weakling, they're also a coward. His boots thudded against the bottom of the lab as he landed. The sound echoed through the empty hallways. In the distance, feet scrambled against cement and someone whimpers softly. It sounded small. Too small. A horrible stench wafted through the corridor. Mihawk struggled to swallow the vomit bubbling at the base of his throat. He could taste the rot in the air as he made his way deeper into the lab. The smell was too fresh to be years old. Which would explain why the world government wanted him here instead of some green marines. Someone was still in the lab. Bars lined the hallway around him. Peeking in, Mihawk spotted bodies lining the floors behind the cell doors. Very small bodies. Children. Mihawk drew in a deep, steadying breath and almost choked on the decay in the air. He'd seen horrors. More horrors than he cared to admit or to remember. But this would rank among the worst of them. Rotting and twisting corpses, missing limbs or sliced wide open. All of them children. Setting his jaw, Mihawk forced himself to continue on. A steel door sat at the end of the hallway and Mihawk quickened his pace as he approached it. He could feel the person in there, the weakling who whimpered when he cut the floor. But, was it a weakling? Was he truly after a hiding pirate? Or? He cast a glance toward the cell closest to the door. Like the others, mangled corpses lay inside. These had more skin, their faces twisted in screams. Steeling himself, Mihawk forced the door open. Lights flickered and buzzed overhead, their fluorescent glow stabbing Mihawk's eye. Incoherent scribblings covered the walls, equations crossed out and rewritten dozens of times. Notebooks and papers filled the tables, unknown substances filled vials lining stainless steel tabletops. Garbage covered the floors, discarded food wrappers and bones of cooked meat. But Mihawk's gaze locked on the white sword leaning against one of the tables. It cried out to him, begging to be freed from the darkness surrounding him. He could feel its power, its beauty. The blade all but cried when he reached out and slid his fingers down its hilt. It looked so familiar. He knew this blade. But how? A chain rattled from the corner, someone scrambling around. Mihawk turned toward the nose. A flash of green caught his eye as it tried to move behind a counter, out of view. The person, the child, growled as Mihawk stepped toward him. Knots matted his long green hair and the hospital gown he wore was filthy and torn. He stunk like bodily fluids and waste, though it was preferable to the decay of the hallway. Despite the harsh snarl, his lip curled up and teeth bared to look threatening, all Mihawk saw in his deep brown eyes was fear. He was thin, unbelievably thin, and his visible skin had bruises of all sizes. "It's all right, child," Mihawk said calmly. "I mean you no harm." Trying to press himself further into the wall, the child hissed at him. Metal rattled again. Mihawk glanced down. A cuff wrapped around the boy's leg, barely hanging on to his thin ankle, and kept him tethered to the corner. "What is your name?" Mihawk tried, squatting down so they would at least be eye level. It proved to be a mistake. The boy lunged toward him, teeth gnashing with every intention of biting. Only the short chain kept him from reaching Mihawk. A painful crack split the air as the chain reached its end and the boy dropped to the ground. He whimpered like a wounded animal and scrambled to crawl back to his corner, favoring his right leg. Sighing, Mihawk glanced around the lab again. Children were not his forte. Even when he was a child, he never got on overly well with young ones. They were difficult to understand or relate to. A feral child was far out of his abilities. But, he couldn't leave the boy. Not in this hellhole. There was no sign of a key to unlock the boy with, so Zoro would have to do once again. All right, child, Mihawk said. Listen to me. I am going to free you from your chain. But, first I must gather the work here. Do you understand? A hiss was his response. It was as good as he was going to get. The boy flinched back harshly when Mihawk stood, hissing and spitting like a tiger cub. Gathering the data didn't take long. Mihawk sent his snail to record the ramblings on the wall as he gathered every piece of paper into his bag. From the corner, the child watched him. His brown eyes were wary, fearful, but attentive. Determined. Even if he immediately looked away any time, Mihawk so much as glanced in his direction. Like the young human drills that would gather to watch him while their parents were hunting for food. Their eyes glittered with the same fear but interest and determination. Setting down the bag of papers, Mihawk pulled his lunch out and settled himself in front of the boy again. His nose crinkled in another snarl, but his nervous brown eyes locked onto the bento box in Mihawk's hand. The sweet smell of onigiri wafted around them, suffocating the wretched smell of death. The boy's tongue darted out and licked his lips. Gingerly, Mihawk pulled one of the rice ball out. The boy snarled, backing himself into the corner when Mihawk held the food out. Perhaps he'd moved too quickly. Or he'd gotten too close for the boy's taste. But he didn't want to place the food on the floor. Not with the state of filth around them. They stared at each other. Mihawk didn't bother to count how many minutes passed before the child inched forward and snatched the rice ball. Watching him eat was like watching an animal. He ripped into the food with his teeth, shaking his head as though trying to tear meat from the bone, despite the rice being easy to chew. It took mere seconds for him to finish every grain of rice, even liking the rice debris from the filthy floor. Mihawk cringed. Then those brown eyes locked on him again, tongue tracing his lips and head pinged to the side. Would you like another? Mihawk asked, reaching for the bento box. The boy watched every movement carefully, all but drooling as Mihawk pulled out another rice ball. It was gone as quickly as the first, the floor licked clean of every ounce of food. The boy licked his lips, like a dog licking its chops. Nodding to himself, Mihawk stood again. The boy growled again, his eyes trailing Mihawk as he reached for Zoro. Our time is limited, child, Mihawk told him. I'm going to free your leg and we will leave together. Yes? The boy snarled. Mihawk decided it was a yes. With practiced ease, Mihawk flicked Zoro down. The chain shattered, bits of metal scattering around them. A whine left the boy's lips and he scrambled away from Mihawk as quickly as he could. He barely made it 5 feet before his body gave out. Mihawk stepped toward him and the boy began spitting and snarling at him like a cat again, but it was far weaker this time. Logically, Mihawk knew he needed to be patient, but he was tired and hungry. Stop that, he said firmly. The spitting stopped, falling into pitiful growls and whimpers. Pulling his jacket off, Mihawk wrapped it around the boy and plucked him from the floor. The boy squirmed, weakly trying to push away from Mihawk to no avail. You are all right, child, Mihawk said. I have no intentions to harm you. The boy continued to squirm weakly, even as Mihawk carried him out of the room. He was so consumed by the child in his arms, he nearly forgot to grab the paperwork he'd gathered and the blade that begged him for help. All of the child's movement stopped the moment they entered the hallway of cells. The boy whimpered, suddenly dead weight in his arms. Panicked, Mihawk stopped to look down at the boy. Relief filled him when he found the boy was still breathing, still alive. Instead of snarling, the boy broke out into sobs. He clung to Mihawk, his nose buried in Mihawk's shoulder. Aina, the boy whined around sobs. Furrowing his brow, Mihawk tightened his grip on the boy and continued on. The soft cries of Aina continued, his voice broken and weak. All right, child, Mihawk said softly. You are all right? The Marines were far more interested in the paperwork than the boy. The Vice Admiral simply told Mihawk to keep an eye on the brat until they figured out if Vegapunk had done anything to him. Any protests Mihawk attempted to give him fell off deaf ears. Especially now that the child has decided he likes Mihawk. Snarls, hisses, and growls follow any attempts to separate the boy from Mihawk. The only emotion the boy showed them other than anger was complete fear in the face of a doctor. Seconds after the Marine's doctor walked into the room, the boy burst into hysterical sobs and warm wet spread down the boy's legs and into Mihawk's pants. No attempts to calm the boy worked and Mihawk swiftly removed himself and his young charge when the boy bit off a piece of the doctor's thumb. Which was how Mihawk found himself in his own kitchen, cooking soup, with a very feral child crawling around. Literally. He didn't move far, having claimed the corner beside the fridge as his own, but he crawled in small circles, peeking at the counters with confusion and awe. You may come out of the corner, Mihawk told the boy patiently. The boy ignored him, still circling his small area like a fawn trying to beat tall grass down to make a bed. Biting back a sigh, Mihawk turned back to his soup. Or, rather, the boy's soup. The doctor insisted that Mihawk feed the boy nothing but soup for the next few weeks. He was thin, far too thin, which meant that refeeding syndrome could be a real concern. While the boy had given up on snarling and growling at Mihawk, he still watched every move warily. He pressed himself tighter into the corner when Mihawk carried the bowl of soup over, clear distrust in his gaze. "This is for you," Mihawk told him. "It may be hot." The bowl clattered softly as he set it on the floor in front of the boy. The child ignored his warning completely. In seconds, he pounced and greedily guzzled down the soup. He didn't seem disappointed at the small amount, barely half a bowl, on the doctor's orders. Instead, the moment the food was gone, he glanced back up at Mihawk again with his head pegged to the side like a lost puppy. To someone who liked children, someone who knew what to do with children, it might have been an endearing gesture. But, not to Mihawk. No. The boy before him was simply a child. A child with big brown eyes that trusted him for an unknown reason. The boy slowly reached out and pushed the bowl back to him. Then, before Mihawk could even pick it up, the boy circled his small corner and curled up like a cat. His soft breathing filled the room as he fell asleep, seemingly unbothered by the cold, hard floor beneath him. Mihawk froze, unsure of what to do next. The boy should sleep in a bed, that's what people did. When a bed was available, they slept in a bed. Did this boy even know what a bed was? That was a question Mihawk couldn't answer. He doubted the boy could answer it. Since he'd stopped softly crying Aina, he hadn't spoken a word. No matter how much he was prodded, he remained silent other than growls and hisses. And even if the boy did know what a bed was, there was no way of telling how long it had been since the boy had slept in a bed. Mihawk remembered how long it took to get used to a bed again. When he spent weeks, months, or years at sea, coming home to his bed made for a difficult night's sleep. It was always too soft. Like he was going to sink through it in the night and be swallowed. If the boy was comfortable on the floor, then so be it. Mihawk washed the dish, checked the castle to ensure none of the young human drills had snuck inside, and returned to the boy. The sun had finally set, bringing a darkness across the kitchen. In the corner, the boy slept soundly, curled with his knees pressed to his chest. Somehow, he managed to look even smaller. Thankfully, summer had come to the island and the boy would be in no danger of freezing in the night. Mihawk stood and stared at him, watching the small chest rise and fall. Each soft breath moved one of his long green hairs. Mihawk sound get him a bath and a haircut as soon as possible. Though, with the boy's reluctance to let anyone within 10 feet of him, as soon as possible could be months away. Perhaps he could bribe the boy with more onigiri. Or more soup. But, that would be needlessly cruel. A bit of dirt and long hair wouldn't hurt him. Mihawk just assumed it was uncomfortable to deal with. And why was he still thinking about this? It was late. The boy was asleep and Mihawk's bed called to him. But his feet refused to move as the darkness began to close in around him. Children were afraid of the dark, weren't they? If the boy woke up, alone and in the dark, would he be scared? Mihawk could light a lamp, but that tended to draw the young human drills in to investigate. And having them in the castle would cause an entire other set of problems. For another moment, Mihawk stared at the boy. Sleeping so soundly, on the cold floor after living in that dingy lab for God only knew how long. How could Mihawk leave him to wake up in the dark? Sheet. The child was already causing him to be weak. Mihawk knew that was the reason he sunk to the kitchen floor, settling himself against a wall so he could see the boy. Like all children, like all love dash, this boy was causing him weakness. He leaned his head against the wall nonetheless and surrendered to sleep. Mihawk woke with a crick in his neck and a pair of brown eyes staring at him. The boy sat in his corner, pressed against the wall with his knees clutched to his chest. At least he wasn't snarling at Mihawk, though his lip twitched as Mihawk stood like he was considering growling again. "Good morning, child," Mihawk greeted. He needed to come up with something else to call the boy. Calling him child felt wrong. Not that the young one seemed to care. He gave no reaction to the name, only following Mihawk as he moved toward the stove. For the first time in his memory, Mihawk found the surrounding silence uncomfortable. He'd always been a solitary person. Even when others were around, Mihawk far preferred the quiet. Until this moment. The boy's eyes followed his every move, ready to snap at a moment's notice. He wasn't frightened. How could a small child that weighed no more than a puppy be scary? But unsettled in a way he couldn't understand. Was this how all people with children felt? Not that Mihawk has a child. This boy isn't his child. This boy is just a child that will go back to the government as soon as they're ready for him. Or, preferably, back to his family. If he had one. The boy dove for the food Mihawk gave him once again, gobbling it down as quickly as he could before sliding the bowl back and retreating to his corner. The whole affair lasted less than 2 minutes. "Now that you've calmed," Mihawk said, picking the bowl up, "can you tell me your name?" "Nothing. Not so much as a peep." With another sigh, Mihawk carried the bowl back to the sink. Making his own breakfast and cleaning up took less time than it normally would. The boy made no move to leave or flee, comfortable in his corner, but Mihawk felt an urgency under his skin to keep an eye on him. It was an unusual urgency, not one driven by fear or the need to protect himself, but rather to ensure that the boy was still there. That he hadn't vanished while Mihawk had his back turned. Finishing the dishes, Mihawk turned back to look at the boy. Still pressed in his corner, still watching Mihawk with careful eyes. "Would you like to come out?" Mihawk asked. The boy's lip pulled up in a snarl. To anyone else might have been frightening, sharp teeth glinting in the light. The show might have worked on whoever had chained him to the wall, but not on Mihawk. He knew an empty threat when he saw one. "You are not required to," Mihawk told him calmly. "It was simply an invitation. I don't require you to stay in the corner." The snarl dropped slightly at Mihawk's even response. Almost as though Mihawk's self-control took him off guard. Silence beat down on them again. The boy pressed himself further into the corner after a few moments. Nodding to himself, Mihawk glanced around. He had a plethora of things to do: check the castle for any damage the human drills might have caused, ensure Zoro was properly cleaned, tend to the garden, just to name a few. Most of those would require him to leave the boy in the kitchen alone for an extended period of time, which Mihawk would prefer not to do. His gaze moved back to the boy, still pressed in his corner. "I'll return in just a moment," Mihawk told him. "If you'd like to come out of the corner, you may. Just don't wander far." Zoro and the white blade that he'd found at the lab sat side by side where he'd left them the night before. Both hummed happily as he grabbed them, pausing to snatch several books on his way back to the kitchen. The boy hadn't moved, though most of the tension had finally faded from his body. Settling both himself and the blades on the floor again, Mihawk flipped open his copy of an illustrated history of graded swords. The white sword wasn't one of the 12 Seijo Owazamono blades. He would have recognized it instantly if it was. But the strength behind the katana meant that it couldn't be ungraded. Clothing rustled. Mihawk looked up. The boy had inched away from his corner, brown eyes wide as he looked at the blade. His overly large medical gown caught around his foot as he moved, tearing itself further. The boy's eyes lacked any sort of fear at the sight of the white blade. Awe and, what might have been, excitement sparkled in those brown orbs. The most emotion Mihawk had seen in the past 24 hours. Mihawk looked back down at the blade before raising his eyes to the boy again. "You know this blade?" Mihawk asked, picking up the white blade. A low, threatening growl left the boy's lips, teeth showing as Mihawk picked up the katana. The fear was back, but it was different. There was no internal fear, no fear for himself. Fear for the blade. "Is it yours?" Mihawk asked. The growling grew louder. Mihawk took it as an affirmative. Giving the boy a weapon was a horrible idea. He acted more like the human drills wandering the jungle than a human child. If Mihawk handed the boy the weapon, the child might very well try to cut his head off. But if a small child could get the jump on him, then Mihawk couldn't truly consider himself the world's greatest swordsman. Making sure to keep every movement slow, Mihawk set the blade down in the same spot he would put his bowls and then backed away. The boy lunged forward, snatching the blade and dragging it back into his corner with him. He cradled it like a teddy bear, hugging it with both arms. "Do you know its name?" Mihawk asked. The boy's eyes raised to him again before flickering down to the blade. More silence. Nodding to himself, Mihawk made his way back to his book. From his corner, the boy clung to his sword and watched in silence. Time ticked slowly, Mihawk flipping through the pages of his book while the boy watched him, almost anxiously. As though waiting. "Wado Ikemanji," Mihawk muttered, pausing on the page of A.O. Wazamono blade. Forged by Shimatsuki Kozaburo. The family name sounded familiar. Shimatsuki. Maybe it wasn't a family name. No. It was a village name. Shimatsuki Village. It had been on Moon Island, in the East Blue, prior to the island's destruction. A sea quake had struck the island, causing it to sink and killing all its inhabitants. Shimatsuki Kozaburo's photo sat beside the picture of Wado. The man had a square jaw, brow furrowed with intensity, and a cocky head tilt. The young boy looked nothing like the blacksmith, not a stitch of familiar features. So why was this boy holding Wado Ikemanji like it was his only lifeline? "Do," the boy rasped in return, nuzzling against the scabbard. "Do." Mihawk stared, unable to look away from the small child. After being so scared for so long, the young boy suddenly seemed content. "Yes," he agreed, finding himself using a quiet voice. "Wado." The nervous brown eyes peeked up at him again, fingers tightening around the scabbard. For a moment, they stared at each other. Then the boy settled himself against the wall with Watto in his hands and sighed contently. "You like swords?" Mihawk asked. The boy glanced at him but didn't answer. Mihawk took it as another affirmative. "All right," he said, picking up the Eternal Forged, the history and lore of Owazamono blades. "How about we learn about swords together?" Despite his concern that the book, a historical account of the great blades and the lore that followed them, might be a bit dry for the boy, it seemed to capture his attention in full. Without loosening his grip on Watto, the boy watched with intent and excited eyes as Mihawk recounted the lore behind Shusui, another blade tied to the Shimatsuki family that was wielded by Ryuma to slay a dragon. By the time Mihawk finished Ryuma's tale, the boy had inched out of his corner. Not by much, but enough for Mihawk to notice. He tried not to smile as he cooked them more soup for dinner. A strange sense of satisfaction filled him, the knowledge that he'd managed to make the boy feel safe enough to sit away from the corner, even by an inch. "Have you ever slept in a bed?" Mihawk asked once the boy finished his soup. The boy stared at him. "Would you like to try to sleep in a bed?" More staring. But he didn't rush back into his corner. Moving slowly, making sure the boy could see every move, Mihawk reached out to pick him up. Still clinging to Watto, the boy flinched but didn't struggle. Color filled the castle as the sun set, falling through the windows to lead him up the steps. He nearly jumped out of his skin when the boy's matted hair ticked his neck. With a wide yawn, the boy settled his head on Mihawk's shoulder, both hands clinging to his sword. Mihawk brought the boy into his room. Leaving him in a room down the hall didn't feel right. It was too far. Pulling the covers back, he gently set the small child in his bed. It made him look even smaller. The boy's nervous brown eyes shot around the room, one hand releasing Watto to press into the bed. He seemed surprised at its softness, confused even. "I will stay in the room with you," Mihawk said, gesturing to the chair on the bed's other side. "In case you need anything. But, you may sleep, child." Oh, how Mihawk wished the boy would say his name. Even if it wasn't his real name. Any name was better than child or boy. Ping his head to the side, the boy pulled Watto close to his chest again and settled against the pillows. Mihawk slowly pulled the blankets up around the boy's shoulders. "Sleep well, child." "Zoro." The raspy, slurred response froze Mihawk before he could move. An unusual weight squeezed Mihawk's chest. It was something that he'd only felt a few times, when he won the title of world's greatest swordsman, when he ran into Shanks and the two of them could drink and spar. Excitement. "Zoro," Mihawk echoed. "Good night, Zoro." Despite his best efforts, Mihawk failed to convince Zoro that exploring the castle might be fun. The young boy went from the bed to his corner, all the while clutching Watto. Though, Mihawk had at least managed to convince Zoro to use a toilet rather than his corner. It took him 3 days, but he counted it as a win. Perhaps his biggest win next to learning Zoro's name. Their days were spent in the kitchen. Zoro and Watto settled into their corner while Mihawk spent his time reading or polishing Euro. He's halfway through their latest chapter of the Eternal Forged, the history and lore of Owazamono blades, detailing the forging of Yamaroshi and its raise from a gradeless sword to one of the greats. He paused at the sound of Zoro's sharp intake of breath, followed by a whimper. The boy scrambled back into his corner, curling around Watto like it would protect him. "Zoro?" Mihawk asked, setting the book aside and pushing himself to his feet. "What is it?" The moment he stepped forward, Zoro's lip curled up in a familiar expression. He hissed at Mihawk, spittle flying from his lips. "What on earth dash?" Mihawk took another step forward. Zoro upgraded from hissing to growling sharply and gnashing his teeth at Mihawk. Freezing where he stood, Mihawk stared down at his young charge. He tried to figure out what had caused the sudden change. For the past 3 days, Zoro had enjoyed listening to the stories. While he'd been uncooperative with several things, changing out of his filthy gown and giving up Watto among them, he'd never put up a fight on listening to Mihawk read. The kitchen appeared the same. None of the dishes had fallen. The human drills had been avoiding them since Mihawk sliced off the arm of one that tried to reach into the kitchen window. Not a thing had changed about the kitchen since they'd sat down after breakfast, except for the small puddle on the floor, but that was a small puddle on the floor. Mihawk blinked and turned his gaze to Zoro again, tracking a small trail of wet from the puddle to his charge. The gown was wet in the front, soaked through with urine. "Oh, you had an accident," Mihawk observed. Zoro hissed at him again. "It's all right, Zoro," Mihawk assured him, taking a step forward. He ignored the growling, lowering himself into a squat across from the boy. "I am not angry. And you are not in trouble." The growling didn't lessen. "Zoro," Mihawk said again. "We need to get you cleaned up." The boy's grip tightened around Watto, the noises spilling from his mouth becoming louder and more distressed. "You do not scare me, Zoro. Nor are you in any sort of trouble. I simply want to help you bathe." Mihawk reached out for the boy. Zoro gnashed his teeth again but made no real attempt to bite him. Letting out a long breath, Mihawk made his decision. He didn't want to traumatize Zoro any more than he already was, but no good would come from the boy sitting in his own filth. Zoro screamed when Mihawk scooped him up, sharp and shrill. Mihawk flinched at the loud noise in his ear but refused to loosen his hold, even as Zoro wriggled desperately. The hissing and the growling were familiar, deep and threatening as a 5-year-old could be. They were meant to scare people away. The scream was different, full of pure panic and desperation. Teeth sunk into Mihawk's shoulder, deep enough to draw blood. It took all of Mihawk's self-control not to react, to ignore the wet seeping down his collarbone. Zoro sobbed, detaching his teeth from Mihawk's flesh, and clutched onto Wado with all his strength. "You are all right, Zoro," Mihawk told him repeated as they climbed the stairs. "You are not in trouble. We simply need to get you into something clean." The poor child reeked. Blood, sweat, urine, and other smells Mihawk would rather not think about assaulted his nose. He should have forced Zoro to bathe days ago, but he'd put it off. For this exact reason. Perhaps not this exact reason. He expected Zoro to be upset, the child was so reluctant to leave his corner, but the screaming was far from what he imagined. Zoro's heaving sobs continued as Mihawk brought him into the bathroom. By the time Mihawk set the boy on the floor, Zoro's entire face was beet red. The moment his feet touched the floor, Zoro bolted for the corner. Wado remained clenched in Zoro's hands, even as he tried to hide against the wall, and his sobs echoed in the room. Mihawk split the next few minutes between watching the bath fill and watching Zoro continue to sob hysterically in the corner. Just as Mihawk turned off the tap, the heavy sound of heaving reached his ears. Zoro retched, vomit tumbling across his lap and the floor. Flecks of bile splattered across Wado's scabbard as Zoro retched again. The young boy alternated between sobbing, hissing, and vomiting. It had been years since Mihawk felt helpless. He prided himself on always being able to keep a level head, to find a solution for any situation. But faced with Zoro's panic, he found himself clueless. Gritting his teeth, he steeled himself and stepped forward. Zoro's vomiting had finally given way to dry heaving, his sobs and hisses petering off. Zoro gasped around his heaves. "God. It's all right, Zoro." Mihawk kept his voice quiet as he knelt in front of the boy. "We're just going to get you cleaned up. You're covered in filth." Too exhausted from his panic, Zoro leaned against the wall and panted. Tears slipped down his face, chest heaving. Mihawk tore the gown off him with little fanfare. Weak whimpers left Zoro's mouth, but he sat limply, as though accepting his fate. Zoro looked so miserable. So broken. And so young. Pain drummed against Mihawk's chest, as though cracks were moving through his heart. Before he realized it, Mihawk's fingers moved upward, brushing the boy's tangled green hair away from his tear-stained face. "It's all right, Zoro," Mihawk promised. The boy sniffled, his breath shuddering. "No," he whimpered. "Good. Zoro, good." "No." Mihawk's brow furrowed. "You have done nothing wrong," he told the boy. "You just need a bath." A single, gasping sob left Zoro's mouth. "No. Zoro, good. No wet. No wet. Zoro, good." Mihawk's gaze flickered to the tub, full of water. "No wet." "All right," Mihawk whispered, nodding to the young boy. "All right." Zoro's eyes tracked Mihawk as he stood. He found a bucket, filling it with the bath soapy water, and grabbed a few washcloths and towels. By the time he returned to Zoro, the boy had calmed enough to breathe normally. "I cannot let you sit in your own filth," Mihawk told Zoro softly. "But I will not make you get in the water." Wetting a washcloth, he offered it to Zoro. For a moment, Zoro stared at the offending item suspiciously. His eyes flickered from the wet cloth to Mihawk and then back again. It took several long moments for Zoro to reach forward and touch the cloth. His fingertip barely made contact with it before he quickly pulled back. "It will not harm you, Zoro." Fingers trembling, Zoro reached forward to touch the cloth. Thankfully, it was still warm. Zoro's touch lasted longer this time, his head pinged to the side with interest. "You can take it," Mihawk told him. Zoro did so, snatching the cloth out of Mihawk's hand and pulling it back to his corner. He turned it in his hand, squeezing it, and even rubbed it against the back of his other hand. Mihawk failed to bite back a smile as Zoro looked up at him with wide and surprised eyes. "Water doesn't hurt you," Mihawk said. "Would you like to hold that cloth while I use this one?" Mihawk pulled another cloth from the bucket, wringing it out. "I'm going to clean away the dirt on you. Like this." He brushes the cloth against his own neck, cleaning away the trails of dried blood. Zoro's eyes widened with surprise and awe. Dropping his gaze to his own cloth, Zoro pressed the cloth against his own leg and rubbed. Some of the dirt caked to his vanishes, leaving a strip of pale skin behind. "Good work, Zoro," Mihawk praised. "That's what a washcloth is for." "Zoro good," the young boy parroted. "Yes," he agreed. "Zoro, very good." Under all the dirt, Zoro was paler than Mihawk expected him to be. He picked his battles carefully, convincing the boy to allow him to brush and cut his matted hair. Though, putting water anywhere close to his head was a battle Mihawk was not willing to fight, and so his hair remained a greasy mess. At least he looked somewhat presentable now, even if he was swimming in Mihawk's shorts and an old shirt. The next battle was Watto. The sight of vomit drying on the blade's scabbard made Mihawk's stomach curl in disgrace. Surely a blade of such caliber would be disgusted with him for allowing such a horrid state. "I just want to clean the katana, Zoro," Mihawk told the boy. "There is vomit all over her scabbard." Clutching onto Watto tightly, Zoro growled at Mihawk from his corner. It would have been easier for Mihawk to beat his own head against a wall. "You need to respect your blade, Zoro," Mihawk told him. "The way Shimotsuki Ryuma did. Do you think he would allow his blade to sit in filth?" Zoro's growls lessened slightly, but his knuckles remained white around Watto's hilt. "Very well." Mihawk stood, ignoring Zoro's wince, and made his way to the library. Yuro's cleaning kit sits patiently on the shelf and Mihawk snatched it up before making his way back to the kitchen. Still pressed in the corner, Zoro watched him with cautious eyes. "If you will not allow me to clean Watto, I will explain to you how to clean it." Zoro blinked owlishly as Mihawk slid the kit across the floor to him. "All katanas deserve respect," Mihawk explained. "They are the soul of a swordsman, Zoro. None should remain tarnished." Ping his head to the side, Zoro looked from his bile-stained sword to the kit in front of him. After a long pause, Zoro's small hand wrapped around the bag and pulled out the contents. Once everything was laid across the floor, Zoro looked back up at him expectantly. Mihawk's lips twitched in relief. "Excellent. We'll begin by removing the sword from its scabbard." Mihawk hated meeting with the other Shichubukai. They were always pointless and mostly ended in Boa Hancock telling them all how hideous they are while Crocodile and Doflamingo argue like the bitter exes they are. Not that either of the idiots will willingly admit it. It was all rather annoying. The only solace he ever found was joining Kuma in silence as they watched Jinbe desperately attempt to quell the arguing so they can just get the DMN meeting over with. Not that it ever worked. They always ended up stuck in the meeting room for hours. And being stuck in the meeting room for hours could only be worse than usual when Mihawk had Zoro with him. Despite his attempted protests, it was made clear that Mihawk would be attending the meeting. And, he could bring Zoro with him for another attempt at a checkup with the doctor. "No go!" Zoro had shouted when Mihawk carried him out of the castle. "No go!" The boy wriggled desperately, clawing at Mihawk's neck and shoulders in an attempt to get back to his corner. Mihawk let out a huff of breath, keeping a tight hold on Zoro. "We will be back," Mihawk told him. "And you will have Watto with you. The entire time. There is nothing to fear. No go." Unsurprisingly, Zoro scrambled to the furthest corner of Mihawk's small boat the moment he set down. The small boy hissed at Mihawk as the boat set off, nose crinkled and eyes full of mistrust. "I'm sorry," Mihawk said, finding that he meant it. The last thing he wanted to do was cause Zoro any more discomfort than he already had. Over the several days since he'd taught Zoro to clean Watto, the boy had inched out of his corner more often. He seemed to relish in the stories Mihawk read him, eyes always locked on him and full of intense interest. "We will return in a few days, Zoro. I promise." Zoro sneered at him, cradling Watto to his chest, and hunkered down. Mihawk sighed, his eyes scanning the young boy. Perhaps while they were out, Mihawk could find him some appropriate clothing. The poor child was absolutely drowning in Mihawk's old clothing and he looked utterly ridiculous. They'd be stopping for supplies at least once or twice on their way to the meeting. Finding clothing for the young boy shouldn't be too difficult. "The journey will take several days," Mihawk said, reaching into his bag. "I brought us a book to pass the time." Time passed slowly, but it was well worth it. Zoro's bad mood slipped away as Mihawk read, the young boy inching toward him. Mihawk continued to read until his young charge leans back against the boat's side and closes his eyes to sleep. Stopping for supplies caused Zoro as much distress as leaving the castle had. The boy hissed and growled like a feral cat, clutching Watto and biting Mihawk for the first 10 minutes of their shopping trip. Eyes followed them as they moved, a few mutters wondering if the boy was being kidnapped. Though, his behavior seemed to convince them that he was not. Any kidnapper would give up on a child causing that much trouble. There was one plus side to Zoro's unruly behavior. The shopkeep of the small clothing shop Mihawk brought Zoro to was so eager to get them out that he didn't even charge Mihawk for his charge's new clothing. By the time they arrive at island, Zoro looks less like a ragamuffin and more like a child. Even if he is a slightly dirty, half-starved child. Or, rather, a slightly dirty, half-starved, feral child. Apparently recognizing the island, Zoro went into a full-blown fit. He threw himself around in Mihawk's grip, screeching like a banshee and waving Watto around to hit whoever he could. Zoro, Mihawk said firmly, ducking another attempt at a blow. Calm down. His only response was more incoherent screaming. The noises echoed around the hallways, drawing attention for every Marine on the base. Mihawk glared at all of them as he passed, jaw clenched as he dodged hits and tried to keep hold of the wiggling child. What the hell is that? Moria's high, annoyed voice demanded as Mihawk carried Zoro into the room. Ignoring the others sitting around the table, Mihawk carried Zoro to the corner of the room closest to his seat. Here you are. He set the boy down, watching Zoro press himself into the corner, his eyes darting around the room. You wait here with Watto. Once I'm finished with my meeting, we will leave. The rest of the Shichubukai watched on, their attention thick in the air. Holding his head high, Mihawk ignored him and made his way to his seat. The Fleet Admiral hadn't arrived yet. The man had an annoying habit of demanding they be on time and then showing up late himself. Well? Moria pressed after a moment. What is that? I believe it's called a child, Boa said, flipping her hair over her shoulder. Mihawk gritted his teeth. He is a child. Is this really a place for a child? Jinbe asked carefully. The fishman's gaze flickered to Zoro, taking in his hunched figure. As though he knew they were talking about him, Zoro hissed at them. We let Boa in, Doflamingo said dismissively, though his eyes sparkled with interest as he looked over at Zoro. I cannot see how it's that much different. Though, I must admit, you aren't the type I would picture playing daddy, Mihawk. I am not a child, Boa snapped. 16 wasn't quite a child, but it certainly wasn't an adult. Mihawk ignored her in favor of glaring at Doflamingo. He wasn't playing father to Zoro. He was simply caring for the child until the Marines found his true family. Somewhat like a babysitter. No. He couldn't use the term babysitter. The world's greatest swordsman couldn't be a babysitter. There had to be a better term. Ever silent, Kuma turned an eye to Zoro, taking him in carefully before turning away. Crocodile looked equally bored by Mihawk's charge. While Mihawk would never consider any of the idiots around this table friends, he barely wanted to consider them acquaintances. He could confidently say that Kuma and Crocodile were currently his favorite. Co-workers? A chair squeaked. Doflamingo made his way over to Zoro faster than Mihawk can stand. Blood pounding in his ears, Mihawk scrambled to his feet, his hand shooting to Euro. In the corner, Zoro hissed and growled, gnashing his teeth. Ooh, so angry, Doflamingo observed. Step away from him, Mihawk growled. Doflamingo ignored him, reaching out a hand to pet Zoro's head. Adorable. You know, Mihawk, I am always looking for . Zoro's teeth clamped down on Doflamingo's hand. The pink-clad man yelped in pain, blood dripping from between Zoro's lips as he shook his head like a dog tearing into its dinner. You little mongrel. Let go. Mihawk shot toward them, bringing Euro to Doflamingo's neck as Zoro tore off a piece of flesh. Screaming in pain and most likely embarrassment, Doflamingo snarled at Mihawk and the small boy behind him. Strings glittered in the air, Doflamingo's threat hanging in the air. Tense silence filled the room. Then a sharp tui broke the silence. The chunk of flesh Zoro had bitten off slid across the floor, stopping a few inches to Mihawk's right. Crocodile laughed. Seconds later, Moria joined in. Well, Kuma drawled. I see the boy takes after you, Mihawk. No, ouch. The doctor jerked back as Zoro snapped at him. Mihawk readjusted his grip and rolled his eyes. After over 30 minutes, the doctor was still too afraid of a child to get close enough to draw blood. Even with Mihawk restraining the boy. If it was up to Mihawk, they would have skipped the ordeal altogether. But the Marines insisted, i.e. he and Zoro could not leave until they did a blood draw. What on earth drawing blood would do, Mihawk wasn't sure, and right now, he didn't care. He isn't going to harm you, Mihawk sighed. The doctor glared at him. He bit off part of Doflamingo's hand. I wasn't speaking to you. The doctor paled at his words. Zoro, Mihawk said. The sooner you allow him to draw your blood, the sooner we may leave. No, ouch. Zoro huffed, wriggling into Mihawk's chest and snapping in the doctor's direction again. Sending a silent prayer up to any being that may be listening, Mihawk shifted Zoro on his lap. Blood draws do no harm, Zoro. It is simply to ensure you are healthy. Watch. The doctor looked at Mihawk like he'd grown a second head when Mihawk offered his own arm out. Mihawk glared in return. He didn't care how ridiculous it might be to get his blood drawn for no reason. If it convinced Zoro to do the same, he would do it. Zoro growled as the doctor approached again and rolled up Mihawk's sleeve. No ouch. No ouch. It isn't an ouch, Mihawk told him, tightening his hold on the boy. Just a pinch. Watch. Every inch of Zoro's body remained tense as the doctor inserted the needle into Mihawk's arm. A small hiss left Zoro's lips, but it was weaker than it had been before. The doctor worked quickly to get the blood, his nervous eyes continually darting toward Zoro as he waited for the vial to fill. Zoro leaned over to look at the small bead of blood the needle left behind. A curious noise left Zoro, his head pinged to the side as he stared down at the mark. No ouch? It was a question instead of a demand. Mihawk nodded. No ouch. Brow furrowed, Zoro looked back to the doctor again. His lip lifted to show his teeth in a silent warning, but he offered his arm out. Mihawk didn't bother to bite back his smile. Roar. Mihawk looked up from the weeds to see Zoro staring down at him with wide eyes. The boy blended into the tree's green almost completely, probably why he'd chosen the spot. Much like his kitchen corner, once Mihawk convinced him to walk around in the garden, Zoro fixated on the lower tree branch. Anytime they were outside the castle, Zoro hid amongst the leaves with Watto slung on his back in the makeshift holster Mihawk cobbled together. Despite his best efforts, Mihawk failed to convince Zoro gardening might be fun. However, they were outside. Mihawk had learned to take wins where he could find them. Roar. Mihawk echoed, wiping some of the sweat from his forehead. Uncertainty sparkling in Zoro's eyes, he nodded. Roar. Furrowing his brow as he tried to decipher the word, Mihawk stood. Nothing had roared. The only noises were the rustling of leaves in the breeze and singing birds. And he couldn't be talking about the human drills. Those were woos. There were no other large animals on the island. And certainly nothing that roared. Stopping at the bottom of the tree, Mihawk gestured for Zoro to come down. Show me? He'd learned over the last several weeks that Zoro cooperated far more when he phrased things as questions. Anything resembling an order had a higher chance of sending him into one of his preferred spots, hissing and spitting. Though, even that didn't exasperate Mihawk the way it once had. A lesser man might have thought it endearing in a strange way, the way Zoro acted like a tiger cub. Hesitantly, Zoro looked over his shoulder and pointed out toward the sea. Roar. A sea king, perhaps. Zoro had yet to see one, mostly because they avoided the island after Mihawk killed one pod of them. It was possible that a new group had moved in. Part of Mihawk hoped they had. The meat was delicious, even if cooking it was time-consuming. Pulling himself onto the wall beside Zoro's tree, Mihawk looked out toward the sea. There was no sea king. A far worse sight greeted Mihawk. Less than an hour's journey from the island was a very familiar-looking ship. A very familiar-looking ship that held a very annoying man and his equally annoying crew. The Jolly Roger soared in the wind, dancing against the blue of the sky. Roar, Zoro repeated from his branch. That's a ship, Zoro, Mihawk sighed. Zoro's brow furrowed and he jabbed a finger toward the offending object. Roar. Roar. Mihawk scanned the ship again. Despite its captain's exuberance, the ship was rather boring and plain. Its wood was a simple brown, except for the figurehead, a white dragon with its mouth open. As though roaring. The figurehead, Mihawk nodded. It's a dragon. They do indeed roar. Come, Zoro. We have visitors. And they're mildly less annoying if there's food to distract them. Curiosity shone in Zoro's eyes as he dropped out of the tree. He continued to glance over his shoulder as he followed Mihawk back to the castle, despite his view being blocked by the wall. Zoro scampered over to his corner, pulling Watto off his back and resting her against his shoulder. His gaze bored into Mihawk as he started the stove and pulled food from the fridge. "Easy?" Zoro questioned. Not quite. The sun is still high in the sky, Mihawk explained. That means it's time for lunch, not dinner. Zoro's lips twisted in displeasure. No matter how many times Mihawk corrected his speech, the boy had no interest in using proper vocabulary for the world around him. In the mornings, he would simply look at Mihawk and request "pop" instead of "toast." Why, Mihawk had yet to understand. But they hadn't spoken much about lunch and Mihawk preferred simple sandwiches when it was the two of them, which didn't make much noise to eat. So, Zoro didn't have his own word for lunch quite yet and he absolutely refused to use the correct words for anything. They fell into a comfortable, familiar routine. Zoro watched Mihawk as he prepared food and began lunch. His sharp eyes followed each movement, head pinged to the side on and off. Mihawk had just gotten the beef to a sizzle and Zoro had inched away from his corner at the smell of food, when the front door slammed open. "Hockey!" Shanks's voice echoed through his hallways. Zoro leapt nearly a foot in the air. He scrambled back into his corner, hissing and snarling as footsteps slammed against the concrete floor. "It's all right, Zoro," Mihawk assured him. "They're annoying but harmless. As harmless as a pirate like Shanks could be." Zoro's angry hisses slowed to low growls. His knuckles were white around Watto's hilt and he stayed in a crouch position, ready to pounce if needed. With any luck, the boy would take Shanks off guard and Mihawk would get to watch the insufferable annoyance suffer the consequences of showing up unannounced. No such luck. The entire red-haired pirate crew spilled into his kitchen with their usual amount of grace. Only Beckman showed any level of awareness or control. Their captain stumbled, almost falling to his knees and losing his hat in his haste, graceful as ever. "Hello, red hair," Mihawk sighed, pulling his bowl of rice from the fridge. "How pleasant to see you." Zoro had proven to be particular about his willingness to try foods. The boy liked toast, meat, and onigiri. Getting anything else near his mouth was like pulling teeth, though Mihawk had managed to sneak some vegetables into his stuffed onigiri occasionally without him noticing. If Shanks heard the sarcasm in Mihawk's voice, he didn't acknowledge it. The captain turned to stare at Zoro with wide and awestruck eyes. "Hawky, when we heard you were a father, I didn't actually think it was true." "Oh, he's so cute," Zoro hissed angrily as Shanks stared at him, teeth snapping in warning. Mihawk's brain was too busy spinning from the red-haired BSDRD's words to warn him that Zoro would bite if he got too close. A father? Absolutely not. He wasn't Zoro's father, simply his protector until the Marines found his family. The rest of the crew piled into Mihawk's kitchen, oohing and awing Zoro as though he was a circus attraction. Zoro's face darkened, his growling becoming more high-pitched. Shutting the stove off, Mihawk turned and made his way to stand in front of Zoro. "You are distressing my charge," he told Shanks and his crew. "Step back. Or lose some of the skin on your hand," Mihawk didn't say. "Ah," the entire crew, sans Beckman, cooed. "Hawky, being a protective daddy," Shanks sniffled. Mihawk's face burned. "I will cut you," he told the redhead. Mischief sparkled in Shanks's eyes and Mihawk set his jaw. Behind him, Zoro calmed. Mihawk could still sense the boy's tension and he could picture Zoro crouched with his face twisted in a slight warning sneer, but the snarling had stopped. "What's wrong?" Shanks asked. "I thought you liked it when I called you Dash. There is a child in the room." Shanks grinned, peeking past him to look at Zoro. Once again imitating a tiger cub, Zoro hissed and spit from behind Mihawk. "He's just like you," Shanks said, sounding almost fond. "Hello, little Hawky." Zoro snarled. Against his better judgment, Mihawk allowed Shanks's crew to spend the night. By the time the crew finished stuffing their faces, the sun sunk low in the sky and it would be a shame for them to lug back to the ship. Zoro made himself comfortable in his corner as the pirates partied, Watto leaning against his shoulder. He remained calm as long as Mihawk remained a few feet from him, only growling when Shanks sat to wrap an arm around Mihawk's shoulders. Which, in turn, caused the pirate captain to chuckle about little Hawky and how possessive he was about his daddy. No amount of threats convinced the idiot to stop. Eventually, Mihawk gave up on trying. He sipped in wine and ensured Zoro didn't attempt to bite anyone's limbs off. The child watched Shanks's crew warily, his temple resting against Watto's hilt. Music erupted as Bonk Punch pulled out his guitar and the rest of the crew burst into song. Mihawk knew the song well. Shanks had been singing Bink Sake religiously since Mihawk had met him. The song sounded less melancholy with the boisterous voices of Shanks's drunken crew. A warmth formed in the air beside Mihawk, body heat invading his space without anyone actually touching him. Slowly, Mihawk looked down to his elbow. Zoro stared at the crew, head ped to the side in confusion as the crew sang and danced to the music. "It's called a party," Mihawk told him evenly. "Some enjoy them. I'm rather indifferent myself." "Sake." Zoro nodded, almost to himself. Mihawk blinked. It's called a party, Zoro." "Parte. Sake," the boy repeated. Mihawk sighed. "Sake," he agreed. The party continued well into the night. Mihawk found himself more interested in Zoro's reactions than to the drunken buffoon stumbling about his castle. Most of the angrily growling and fearful hisses vanished as the night wore on. The young boy remained at Mihawk's side, curiosity in his eyes as though the crew were the strangest thing he'd ever seen. "You always throw the best parties, Hawky," Shanks said, dropping into the open space beside Mihawk and wrapping an arm around his shoulders. Zoro's hackles rose immediately. He bolted into Mihawk's lap, knocking his glass of wine to the floor, and snapped at Shanks' hand, teeth just missing the captain's fingertips. Shanks jerked away in surprise, sake flying across the floor. Continuing to growl, Zoro pressed himself against Mihawk's chest. The party fell silent, apart from Zoro. Mihawk stared down at the child, frozen. It wasn't as though he was afraid of Zoro. The boy was barely 50 pounds, soaking wet, but if he moved too suddenly, he might frighten the child, who had finally initiated physical contact. Even if it was only to bite Mihawk's Friday acquaintance. Laughter erupted from the rest of the crew. Several of them tipped onto the floor, rolling drunkenly in their fits of amusement. The sudden noise caused Zoro to tense, sinking further into Mihawk's chest as he hissed at Shanks. "The little guy got you good, Cap'n," Yasopp laughed. Putting a hand to the top of his hat, Shanks chuckled. "I guess he did." Mihawk fought to keep himself from wrapping an arm around Zoro's small frame and pulling him closer as Shanks's gaze turned to them. The surprised amusement faded to something more soft in the captain's eyes. Something almost fond. "Don't worry, little hawk," Shanks said. "I'm not going to hurt you or your daddy." With a final hiss, Zoro nuzzled his head against Mihawk's shoulder and closed his eyes. You." Mihawk spluttered, his face red as he glared at Shanks. Shanks continued to grin. "I'm taking Zoro to bed." "Do not destroy my castle," Mihawk told them shortly. He stood with care, ensuring he had a firm hold on both Zoro and Watto. The crew parted for him, leaving plenty of room for Mihawk to carry his charge though. Zoro hummed softly against his chest, as though enjoying the change in scenery. Like Mihawk, he was probably relieved to be away from the ridiculous antics of Shanks and his crew. The small boy yawned when Mihawk sat him down on the bed, curling against the pillows and hugging Watto like a stuffed animal. With a smile pulling at his lips, Mihawk pulled the blankets up to Zoro's shoulders and carefully tucked him in. Tired brown eyes watched him, full of a question. "I'll sleep in my chair," Mihawk assured him. "I have no intentions of leaving the room, Zoro." Apparently satisfied with the answer, Zoro closed his eyes and snuggled further beneath the blankets. "Sleep well, Zoro," Mihawk whispered. "Clouds," Zoro muttered, his voice soft and weak with sleep. "Daddy." Mihawk's breath caught in his throat. Oblivious to the shock he'd caused, Zoro let out a soft hum and drifted off to sleep. Rooted to the spot, Mihawk stared down at the young boy. "Daddy." That was Shanks's fault. He'd spent the night referring to Mihawk as Zoro's daddy and it had likely confused the young boy. He was so naive, even for his age, and didn't seem to have a full understanding of anything. Did Zoro even fully understand what the word daddy meant? He couldn't possibly. The boy had to know that Mihawk wasn't his father. Just a placeholder until the Marines managed to figure out who Zoro was and how to locate his true family. His true father. The thought caused a knot to grow in his chest. Zoro had only lived with him for a few weeks, not even quite 3 months yet. He couldn't have allowed himself to get that attached to Zoro. Mihawk knew better than that. He reached out to fix the blanket, tucking it around Zoro's shoulder, and tried to ignore the growing desire in his own chest. His lifestyle wasn't suitable for a child. Mihawk didn't even like children. Letting out a long breath, he stupidly allowed his fingers to brush the greasy bangs away from Zoro's forehead. "Good night, my little tiger." Cluck. Cluck. "Daddy." Cluck. Cluck. "Only a few more moments, Zoro," Mihawk said, using his fingertips to scrub the soapy washcloth against Zoro's greasy green locks. "Once we're done, you can go dash." "No go." Cluck. Cluck. "We are not traveling, Zoro." Mihawk bit back a sigh. "Once we are done, we shall see your tree." "Rustle," Zoro chirped happily, seemingly forgetting that Mihawk had mentioned anything about travel. Even as he grew more comfortable with Mihawk and being outside the castle, though his particular affinity for his tree remained dash, Zoro hated travel. Any time they needed to go on a supply trip, Zoro would throw a fit, screeching, "No go," the entire time Mihawk carried him to the boat. 6 months and 6 supply trips and Zoro still hated leaving the island. No amount of bribing helped. Especially given that the boy detested anything sweet. Most children, Mihawk thought, like sweets, candy, chocolate, anything bad for them. Zoro took one look at the cotton candy a shopkeeper offered him and screamed like the man told him it was time to take a bath. Cluck. Cluck. Rustle. Zoro squirmed beneath the washcloth, clearly losing patience quicker now that Mihawk mentioned his tree. Washing his hair hadn't caused an all-out tantrum, like Mihawk's first attempt to bathe him, but the young boy continued to make his displeasure clear. He'd taken to tootling his tongue twice, like Mihawk did when Zoro did something less than desirable. Shanks thought the whole thing to be hysterical, though Shanks seemed to think everything related to Zoro was hysterical. "I need to rinse," Mihawk told Zoro. "Or your scalp will itch." "No wet." "No wet," Mihawk agreed. "We're going to use another cloth, Zoro." Mihawk wished he could use a cup. Rinsing Zoro's hair the traditional way would certainly save them time. Painstakingly using a wet washcloth to squeeze out any trace of soap from the short green locks was the bane of Mihawk's existence. It took no less than an hour and, by the end, Mihawk's back was always sore. "Russell," Zoro said again, wiggling wildly under Mihawk's hands. "Russell. You cannot go out to the tree until we finish rinsing your hair, Zoro." Zoro huffed, crossing his thin arms over his chest. "Wet?" Mihawk's fingers froze. "Wet?" he asked. Zoro shifted and pointed a finger at the bucket of clean water Mihawk has dunked the rinsing cloth in. "Wet? You want me to use the bucket to rinse your hair?" A short nod. "Wet? Are you sure?" "Sure," Zoro parroted. "Wet. Russell, Daddy. Very well." Mihawk pulled the bucket closer. "We will do it slowly. If you wish for me to stop, just tell me." "Wet. Tip your head back." Zoro allowed Mihawk tip his head backward and stared at the ceiling patiently. Adjusting himself, Mihawk carefully dunked a cup into the warm water and brought it to hover over Zoro's head. The boy was far calmer than Mihawk was. Logically, he knew there was no danger in rinsing Zoro's hair. If anything, it would get them both out of the bathroom quicker. But if he did it wrong, Zoro might go back to refusing to step foot in the bathroom at all. "Russell, Daddy." Cluck. Cluck. "Yes," Mihawk agreed. "Yes, Zoro. We'll see your tree afterward." Placing his free hand over Zoro's forehead, hoping to keep any of the water from splashing down to his face, Mihawk pulled in a deep breath and dumped the cup over Zoro's hair. The boy jumped but didn't screech or hiss. Mihawk breathed and finished rinsing his hair. By the time he finished, Zoro had stopped tensing at the feeling of water cascading down his head. "Excellent," Mihawk praised as he began to dry Zoro's hair. "You did wonderful, Zoro." "Zoro good." "Very good," Mihawk agreed. "Now, let's get you dressed." Once Mihawk had wrestled a shirt and pants onto the boy, he tied Zoro's boots, ignoring the protests, "Cluck. Cluck. Daddy. Cluck. Cluck," and gave him the approval to head outside. Beaming, Zoro snatched Watto from her spot near the door and raced out the door. Smiling fondly, Mihawk gathered the washcloths and towels. By the time he made it outside, Zoro had just scrambled into his tree. It was a sure sign that the boy had gotten turned around again. How he could possibly get lost in his own home, after almost 8 months of living there, Mihawk couldn't be sure. Despite his best efforts to point Zoro in the right direction, the boy seemed unable, or unwilling, to go in the correct direction. "I'm going to start dinner," Mihawk said, stopping at the bottom of the tree and looking up at Zoro. "Do you have any requests?" "Noms. We had onigiri for dinner last night, Zoro." "Noms." Mihawk sighed. "I will make you one onigiri. But you must try other foods." Cluck. Cluck. Shaking his head, Mihawk made his way back to the kitchen. He opened the fridge door, eyeing its contents. So far, Zoro had snubbed his nose at steaks and vegetables. So, perhaps, Mihawk needed a different idea. He had the onions, peas, carrots, and eggs as well as the rice to make an egg fried rice. Perhaps if he made something similar to onigiri, Zoro would be more willing to eat it without Mihawk bribing him. Cooking was far different than mediating, but Mihawk found solace in it all the same. The repetitive thud of his knife, the clink-clink as Zoro insisted on calling it, chopping onions brought calm and serenity. The smell of oil sizzling washed any phantom sense of filth or the monkeys. "Daddy." Zoro's voice almost made him jump out of his skin. He'd been so focused on the size of his carrot chunks that he hadn't noticed the boy's arrival. "Roar." Mihawk turned to look at him. "A ship?" Zoro nodded, jabbing a finger toward the door. "Hat. Roar." "Shanks? What on earth was Shanks doing there?" Last Mihawk had heard, he was in the New World, picking a fight with every marine ship he could find. That meant the fool was either there to lick his wounds or brag about what he'd accomplished. Mihawk sighed. "I have to hide the good sake." "Hat. Sake?" "Most likely," Mihawk sighed. "That crew does nothing but party." "Lalas?" "I'm sure they'll sing for you, Zoro." Zoro nodded. "Good hat." Mihawk missed the days when Zoro was wary of Shanks' crew. But their insistence of showing up whenever they please, always with gifts for the boy. Mostly sword-related book, but all things that made Zoro warm up to them a little more. Especially when Bonk Punch arrived with new songs to sing. Zoro retreated to his corner, content to watch Mihawk scramble to prepare a feast. He shouldn't be encouraging the red-haired pirates to return to his home time and time again, but it was easier to tolerate them when they weren't hungry and when Mihawk had several glasses of wine in his stomach. He'd almost finished the food when his door slammed open. "Mihawk." Shanks's voice rang through the air. Mihawk's body tensed at the sound of his own name. Shanks didn't call him by his real name, not unless there was trouble. "We need to talk, now." Only Shanks entered his kitchen, jaw tense. The stench of non-stop travel rolled off the man in waves, filling Mihawk's delicious-smelling kitchen. Hat? Zoro's uncertain voice drew both of their attention. The small boy clutched Watto close, apparently well aware of the intensity rolling from Shanks's presence. His voice was quiet, quieter than Mihawk had heard it in months, and he drew his shoulders up to his neck. "Hey, little hawk," Shanks greeted gently. "It's all right. I didn't mean to scare you. I just need to talk to your daddy for a few minutes, all right?" Zoro hunkered further into his corner, his gaze shooting to Mihawk. His nose crinkled, the start of a growl already forming on his face. "It's all right, little tiger," Mihawk told him. "Nothing to be afraid of." Distrust filled Zoro's eyes as he looked back at Shanks, his lip curling up. Regret filled Shanks's face as he turned to Mihawk, shaking his head. "Hawky, I really don't think I'm not leaving him." Mihawk refused to leave his son with this much fear on his young face. Zoro relaxed only slightly as Mihawk turned off the stove and moved to sit on the floor a few feet away. His silent offer was accepted. Zoro crawled over to him, settling himself on Mihawk's lap with Watto cradled in his arms. Hesitantly, Shanks let out a breath. "You need to leave the island." "No go." Zoro snapped immediately, hissing at Shanks. To his credit, Shanks ignored the boy, staring at Mihawk instead. "They're coming for your boy, Hawky." "Who?" No one would dare try to take Zoro from him. He was the world's greatest swordsman. His presence sent even the Marines cowering to the nearest corner. The Marines. Mihawk's brow furrowed. That couldn't be right. Not unless they found his family? Shanks shook his head. Desperately. He doesn't have a family. Not anymore. You make no sense. He's from Shimotsuki village. The whole island was destroyed. Everyone on the island is dead. The world government wasn't going to let anyone escape. At the name of his village, Zoro let out another growl, baring his teeth at Shanks. "What dash?" "It doesn't matter," Shanks interrupted before Mihawk could begin. "Listen, Mihawk, I went after the fruit. The gum know me." The fool had been talking about it for ages, about how the government had to want it for something. And when the world government wanted something, it was never for anything good. But Mihawk never thought Shanks would actually try to find the fruit. "We didn't find it. But we found a few other things. Things the world government wouldn't want anyone to know about. Along with the paperwork from Vegapunk's lab. Paperwork on Zoro." Unconsciously, Mihawk's grip on Zoro tightened. The boy allowed himself to be pulled closer to Mihawk, hunkering down and hissing lowly at Shanks. The world government wanted him to recreate something. They gave him the blueprints, but he didn't want to create a thing from instructions. He wanted to do something no one else had done. Or could do. Mihawk's patience wore thin. All of this usually talk of the world government and a scientist that had been missing for over a year. That couldn't be what Shanks barged into his house and scared his child for. What does any of this have to do with Zoro? Zoro was the experiment, Mihawk. He's not just some kid. Vegapunk used him to recreate an ancient weapon. And now the Marines know. They're coming for him. Mihawk's eyes dropped to the boy in his lap, lips still curled up to show his teeth. An ancient weapon. It wasn't possible. Was it? "Mihawk," Shanks said firmly. "We need to go." Zoro snapped his teeth at the words, shifting to crouch in Mihawk's grasp. Clutching him tighter, Mihawk stood. "Zoro's clothes are in my room." Shanks bolted up the stairs. "No go." Zoro howled, writhing in Mihawk's grasp. "Daddy. No go." "It's all right, Zoro." Mihawk held the boy tightly as he grabbed Yoru and made his way to the library. "You have nothing to fear." Footsteps crashed over their heads as Shanks no doubt began pulling apart the bedroom. Mihawk snatched several books, juggling them and Zoro as his boy continued to scream and hiss in distress. Shanks met them at the bottom of the stairs, a bag in his hand. "2 extra sets of clothes, each. We'll buy you more later." Mihawk nodded, dumping his armload of supply, books, cleaning kits, first aid kits, into the bag as well. "Captain!" A single shout from Lucky Roo was their only warning. A bolt of yellow light cut through the castle wall. Mihawk dropped to the ground, covering Zoro's head from the debris as part of the front wall crumbled. They'd sent an admiral. Not that he should be surprised. If Zoro really was an ancient weapon, then only the highest ranking of the Marines would be allowed to know it. And sending anyone less than an admiral would mean the Marines didn't recognize what an actual threat Mihawk was. The BSTRDS were stupid, but not that stupid. Zoro screamed in Mihawk's arms, high and hysterical. Mihawk clutched him tighter, pulling Yoru from his back as he stood to face the admiral. "Hand over the boy, Hawkeyes." Mihawk didn't dignify the order with a response. "As a Shichubukai, you are required to follow orders from the world government. Or did you forget?" "No." Shifting Zoro's weight, Mihawk forced as much boredom into his tone as he could. I just don't care. Consider this my resignation. The Admiral snarled. Hawky. Shanks stepped up beside him, straw hat sitting low on his head. Get him to the ship. I'll handle this. Months ago, Mihawk would have scoffed at the idea of leaving a fight. Now, with Zoro sobbing in his arms, he knew he didn't have a choice. Ben. Shanks called. On it, Captain, Beckman replied, even as ever. The Admiral moved as Mihawk did, but Shanks intercepted him quickly. In his arms, Zoro scratched and squirmed in a desperate bid to get away. Mihawk tightened his grip, ducking under a beam of yellow. You're all right. I've got you, Zoro, Mihawk promised. Daddy. 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 Zoro's wail split his chest as he moved. Beckman was already waiting for them, the rest of the crew spread out around the castle to interfere should the Admiral get away from Shanks. Don't let Captain stay long, Beckman ordered as Mihawk shot past him. We've got ships on the horizon. Yassop. While they tended to be drunken idiots, the red-haired pirates could be more than efficient when the occasion called for it. The island shuddered beneath Mihawk's feet as he moved, trying desperately not to drop his wriggling son. Somewhere behind him, crackling crept through the air as fire began to spread across the trees. Daddy. Daddy. Every screech from Zoro was sharp and distressed, as though begging Mihawk to do something. To bring him back to the home he'd learned to be so comfortable in. But there was no going back now. There was only the ship ahead of them. Sheet. A single cry was the only warning Mihawk had before his leg gave out. The agony of a hole as his calf took longer than it should have to set in, racing up his leg like fire chasing gasoline. Zoro slipped from his grip, the small boy tumbling and rolling a few feet away. Watto fell from his back, blade sliding out of her scabbard and spinning away from Zoro. Gunshots filled the air as Beckman fired at something over Mihawk's head. Zoro scrambled to his knees, tears staining his cheeks as he looked around. His eyes landed on Watto first and Mihawk tried to pull himself up when as his son crawled toward the blade. Pain beat med. He needed to get to Zoro. Beckman yelped, a streak of yellow exploding through the man's shoulder. Gritting his teeth, Mihawk turned and pulled Yoru loose. His leg protested the movement, screaming in pain as he forced himself to stand. Admiral Yamazora was known for his cruelty. Pirates the world over feared the Admiral, whispered about his devil fruit, the Pika Pika no Mi, one of the most powerful and feared devil fruits known to man. Mihawk wasn't among them. He'd perfected hockey at the age of only 15. He'd dragged himself up from the slums of the city. He'd earned the title Marine Hunter. He refused to fear a Marine. No matter what his devil fruit was. Daddy. Zoro screamed behind him, voice thick with tears. Daddy. Daddy. Well, isn't that sweet, Yamazora hissed. And here I thought you were a cold-blooded killer. Too much of a man to be pulled down by the weakness of a child. Mihawk's fingers tightened around Yoru's hilt. Not a child. His child. Daddy. 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 The ground at their feet shattered. Bits of stone and rubble jumped into the air around them as a shock wave slammed into Mihawk's back. He hit the ground, head cracking against a rock. Buzzing filled his ears, his vision blurring as he tried to sit himself up. A resounding thud made it past the buzzing. Yamazora's body hit the ground where he once stood, the man's neck twisted at a strange angle and his eyes wide with frozen horror. In the distance, voices screamed. Everything was fuzzy and numb as Mihawk rolled himself onto his back, blinking up at the sky as black smoke wafted through the air. Daddy. 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 Small hands grasped him as Zoro crawled across his chest, hiccuping with sobs. The black smoke grew, spreading across Mihawk's vision. Everything faded to darkness. Zoro curled at his side, sobbing and whimpering. Daddy. A pounding head brought Mihawk out of the blissful, painless arms of unconsciousness. He wished it would have stayed. Anything was better than the sharp drum of agony beneath his skin. A small, warm body pressed against his side. A low, angry growling rumbled before it turned to a sharp and infuriated hiss. Zoro, you have to let Hongo check his bandages. Zoro hissed wildly. Bits of spittle flecked across Mihawk's face and arms. The high and distressed noises continued and Mihawk could just barely hear Shanks's heavy sigh over them. Zoro, I don't want to make you move, but I will. Come on, little hawk. You don't even have to leave the bed, all right? More angry hissing. Mihawk fought to open his eyes. His stiff muscles refused to work at the speed he wanted them to. Zoro's weight shifted beside him, warning growls and hisses raising until they bordered on screaming. Zoro, Mihawk forced himself to say. It scraped against his dry throat, syllables catching weakly. Calm down. How the young boy managed to hear him over the rest of the noise in the room, Mihawk wasn't sure. But the growling stopped immediately and Zoro shifted to curl as close to him as humanly possible. A weak whimper reached Mihawk's ears as Zoro nuzzled himself closer. "It's all right," he whispered, bringing his hand up to cup the boy's back and pull him closer. "It's all right, Hawkie." Mihawk ignored Shanks's relieved voice in favor of pulling Zoro a little closer. "Hongo," Shanks warned. "Go slow." Little Hawk's still skittish. Floorboards creaked under slow and careful footsteps. Mihawk's vision blurred as he forced his eyes open again, blinking up at Hongo. The doctor's hand was wrapped in a bandage, smudges of red seeping through and a bruise formed around his eye. Zoro moved suddenly, crouching over Mihawk, and growled angrily at Hongo. The doctor froze, hands up in a gesture of peace. It only caused a fresh round of hisses. "Zoro," Hongo said patiently. "I just want to check your daddy's bandages. No one's going to hurt him." Zoro gnashed his teeth. "Zoro," Shanks said firmly. "I meant it, Little Hawk. I will move you if I have to." Mihawk wanted to tell the captain he would do no such thing. But his throat was dry and his head spun wildly. All he could do was tighten his hold on Zoro. "Let him look, Zoro," Mihawk rasped. "It's all right." Zoro continued to growl but at least stopped gnashing his teeth. Hongo moved slowly, eyeing Zoro carefully as he worked. Tension kept Zoro's body ramrod straight and Mihawk could sense the small boy watching Shanks's doctor with suspicious eyes. "How are you feeling, Mihawk?" Hongo asked. Better than he expected to. As the disorientation of sleep faded, breathing became easier, and the world seemed clearer. "I'm all right." Hongo frowned but nodded. "You fared far better than we expected." Mihawk hummed and shuffled himself up. Zoro grumbled at the movement, scrambling to keep himself pressed against Mihawk's chest. The pain continued to drip away, leaving Mihawk surprisingly relaxed. Zoro hummed happily, nuzzling himself further into Mihawk's arms. "You gave us a scare, Mihawk," Shanks told him evenly. The use of his real name sent a shiver down his spine. Especially Little Hawk. He was pretty inconsolable. Mihawk looked down at the small boy in his arms. Soot and dirty streaked Zoro's hair. He stunk like blood and smoke. "How long?" Mihawk asked. "Just a day," Hongo replied. "Ben said something about a shockwave, knocked you all out. Little Hawk was out of it too, but he's all right. From what I can tell." The doctor waved a vague hand and it was only then that Mihawk noticed the white bandages wrapped around the hand. Obviously, he hadn't gotten too far in examining Zoro. "Zoro," Mihawk said softly. "Are you hurt anywhere?" Without a word, Zoro pressed himself closer to Mihawk. Hongo heaved a heavy sigh. "I'd like to examine him," the doctor admitted. "But he's not willing to let me anywhere near him." Frowning, Mihawk turned his attention back to the small boy in his arms. "Zoro. You know Hongo wouldn't hurt you." Zoro growled. Hongo shook his head. "We tried, Mihawk. Shanks even let me stick him with some needles. Nothing. Strange. That had worked last time." Zoro had been so willing to allow the marine doctor to examine him after Mihawk had shown him there was nothing to be afraid of. "Perhaps if you try on me," Mihawk said, offering his arm out to Hongo. It was entirely possible that Zoro didn't trust Shanks enough. The boy certainly liked the captain, but that fondness didn't mean trust. Hongo looked uncertain but nodded, adjusting his bag and taking Mihawk's arm. Sensing the movement, Zoro spun. In the blink of an eye, the young boy lunged at Hongo, teeth snapping angrily. Hongo jerked backwards, tripping his own 2 feet to avoid Zoro's angry biting. Mihawk tightened his grip on Zoro, pulling the squirming boy into his chest. "Zoro," he scolded. Zoro ignored him, snarling and snapping his teeth in fury as he tried to get to Hongo. "Zoro," Mihawk repeated, putting a little more force behind his voice and pulling the boy closer to him. Shanks stepped forward to help Hongo stand. Zoro roared, gnashing his teeth desperately as he tried to lunge at the captain and his doctor. Struggling to keep his hold on the flailing boy, Mihawk tried to bury his shock. Even when Mihawk first forced the boy to see the marine doctor, he hadn't been like this. "Zoro, that is enough," Mihawk ordered, his voice almost buried under Zoro's angry snarls. The order was ignored. Shanks pulled Hongo to his feet and dragged him to the door. The distance calmed Zoro. Finally calming from raging roars to simply grumbles, Zoro settled back against Mihawk's chest. His brown eyes stalked Shanks and Hongo. "He's been like that since he woke up," Shanks said from the doorway. "Won't let us near you." Nearly took Hongo's hand off. "I can't get him to talk to us. He's scared." "I know, Hawk. But we can't help him if we can't get near him. He's got dried blood all over him, but we can't see if there's anything under his shirt." Glancing down, Mihawk saw that there was blood dried across Zoro's skin and his shirt. He moved as though he hadn't been injured, but Zoro was all too much like a cat, able to hide any injuries without issue. Zoro, Mihawk said softly, tugging at the hem of Zoro's shirt. Let me see. Grumbling, Zoro glanced between Mihawk and Shanks. Frowning, Mihawk took the boy's chin between his fingers. Little Tiger. The nickname allowed Zoro's shoulders to relax and his growls to tamper off. His wide, scared brown eyes blinked up at Mihawk. Let me see, Mihawk said again. Hesitantly, Zoro allowed Mihawk to pull his shirt up. A breath of relief left Mihawk's lips instantly. Despite the red staining the boy's pale chest, there were no wounds on his body. It appeared all of the blood belonged to Mihawk, and perhaps the Admiral. Zoro blinked up at him, eyes still wide and owlish. A small hand reached out, fingers splayed as Zoro rested his palm against Mihawk's chest. Daddy, Zoro mouthed. He's alright, Mihawk told Shanks, tugging Zoro back against his chest. You're alright, little tiger. Silently, Zoro nuzzled closer to him. Burying his nose in Zoro's green hair, Mihawk placed a kiss on the boy's crown. Months ago, before Zoro, Mihawk would have never let anyone see him like this, weak and vulnerable, showing how completely he'd allowed himself to care for, not even Shanks. But now he has to make sure Zoro understood how safe he was. That as long as Mihawk was with him he was safe. He always would be. I'll bring you two some lunch, Hongo said, vanishing down the ship's hallway. Shanks lingered in the doorway, uncharacteristically uncertain. His gaze searched Mihawk and Zoro desperately, as though searching for something. The floor creaked beneath Shanks's feet as he took a step into the room. Zoro's growled, head snapping in Shanks's direction and hands tightening around Mihawk's shirt. Tension rocked through him, every muscle like a coiled spring. Zoro, Mihawk whispered. It's only me, little hawk, Shanks said, though he stopped just inside the doorway. Zoro hissed violently. Shanks stepped back, out of the doorway and Zoro's growls tampered off. He settled back against Mihawk, though his eyes remained locked on Shanks. Go, Mihawk told Shanks quietly but firmly. He won't rest until you do. Hurt flashed across Shanks's face, his gaze lingering on Zoro's tense body. They'd gotten somewhat close over the months Zoro had spent with him and Shanks seemed to wear Zoro's acceptance like a badge of honor. A badge that had been stripped from him in a matter of minutes. Yell if you need us, Hawky, Shanks said. We're all here if you need us, little hawk. Zoro hissed softly. Shoo, Zoro, Mihawk soothed. Get some sleep. Shanks left without another word. Mihawk was grateful. The moment the captain disappeared from sight, Zoro settled against his chest again. He kept his white-knuckle grip around Mihawk's shirt, little green head nuzzling into his shoulder. Mihawk tightened his arm around Zoro, pulling the small boy closer. It's all right, little tiger, Mihawk promised. We're safe now. For now. The world government had a habit of being annoyingly persistent. Regardless, Zoro was safe. Would be safe. Mihawk wouldn't have it any other way. Zoro's screams rang through the ship, ripping Mihawk from any semblance of sleep he'd fallen into. At his side, Zoro thrashed, kicking and striking out for all he was worth. Little fists collided with Mihawk's side, little feet slamming into his legs. Zoro, Mihawk said, snatching the boy's arm gently. Zoro, wake up. The hallway was quiet, meaning the crew had finally come to realize that they would do more harm than good. Over the past several days, Zoro had gotten little sleep, meaning Mihawk had gotten little sleep. And, Zoro also hadn't gotten any semblance of normalcy back. Despite mouthing Daddy a few times, Zoro hadn't spoken a word. He continued to hiss, growl, and whine to communicate, foregoing words altogether. And he was back to biting. Shanks and Hongo both bore the proof on their skin, Zoro's deep and angry teeth marks littering their arms from their vain attempts to help. Zoro's eyes snapped open, dark brown. Orbs full of anger and fear. Kina. His cry caught Mihawk off guard, tears filling the small boy's eyes. Kuina, Zoro whimpered, his face scrunching up. Mihawk could see the sobs coming. The pinch of Zoro's brow and the confusion in his watery eyes. Zoro, Mihawk said softly, moving slowly to wrap his arm around the small boy and pull him into a hug. Kuina. The sobs came with the name, desperate and broken. Kuina. Kuina. Was she a sister? A friend? Was she family that was searching for him? Mihawk hugged Zoro tighter, smoothing back his hair and wiping away his tears. Zoro attached to him like a parasite, sobbing and burying his head in Mihawk's collarbone. Resting his chin on Zoro's head, Mihawk began to rock. The movement seemed to help. Slowly, Zoro's tears petered off into soft whimpers. Mihawk placed a kiss to Zoro's crown again, pulling back just enough to look down at the boy's face. Tears stained Zoro's cheeks and he sniffled, wiping hopelessly at his face. There you are, little tiger, Mihawk promised, brushing a few stray tears away from Zoro's face. It's all right. Watto, Zoro whimpered. Mihawk blinked. In the past several days, Zoro hadn't asked for Wado once. After each dream, Zoro had clutched to Mihawk, sobbing and sniffling without a single word. Mihawk had completely forgotten about the sword, too engrossed in Zoro's nightly nightmares. Without thought, Mihawk leaned down to grab the white sword sitting beside him. Zoro snatched the sword with unusual force, cradling it like he hadn't since his first night with Mihawk. "Wado," Zoro whispered, tears sparkling in his eyes as he looked up at Mihawk with obvious distress. "Kuina." "Wado." Furrowing his brow, Mihawk stared down at Zoro. "Wado," he said slowly, "belongs to Kuina." "Wado, Kuina," Zoro agreed, hugging Wado closer. Mihawk nodded, brushing a finger across Zoro's cheek. "Where is Kuina?" Mihawk knew he wouldn't like the answer, but he needed to know. Zoro burst into tears again. "Ouch! Kuina, ouch!" "Oh!" Mihawk wasn't surprised. He knew exactly what Zoro was going to tell him, that Kuina had been in that lab. That she hadn't made it. But, he desperately hoped Zoro was going to tell him something else, anything else. "Oh, Zoro," Mihawk whispered, pulling the boy back into his arms. "Ouch," Zoro wept. "Ouch." "It's all right, Zoro," Mihawk promised. "No more ouch. I promise. No more ouch." Cluck, cluck. Rustle. Mihawk sighed, and gestured toward the plate in front of him. "Eat, Zoro." Zoro shoved the angrily away, frowning at Mihawk. Cluck, cluck. "Rustle," he demands again. Mihawk sighed, eyes shooting to Shanks briefly. The captain frowned back at him, but remained in his seat across the galley. While Zoro had gotten better over the past few weeks, allowing Mihawk to leave his immediate area and allowing the rest of the crew near them, he still wasn't overly fond of anyone approaching them when he was worked up. "Zoro," Mihawk sighed. "We cannot return to your tree. I'm sorry." "Rustle," Zoro said again. Mihawk pushed the plate back to Zoro. "You must eat. Rustle. Rustle. Rustle." Across the galley, one of Shanks's crew stood to put their plate away. Zoro flinched, toppling out of his seat and began hissing and spitting wildly. "Zoro," Mihawk said, standing to reach for the boy. Zoro kept his eyes across the galley, still hissing and growling, but allowed Mihawk to pull him into his arms. "It's all right, little hawk," Shanks assured him, raising slowly. "Lucky's just putting his plate away." Settling against Mihawk's chest, Zoro quieted his hisses and looked around with suspicious eyes. Letting out a long breath, Mihawk wished someone would tell him what to do. How to help Zoro understand that they would never be able to return to his tree, to their home. Zoro refused any further attempts to encourage him to eat. He remained on Mihawk's lap, curled against his chest and clutching onto Wado's scabbard. "He's asleep," Shanks said, walking over slowly. Glancing down, Mihawk found Zoro. He breathed slowly and evenly, surprisingly still for the first time in weeks. "Want me to take him so you can get up?" Shanks offered. Mihawk shook his head. "I don't know what to do," he admitted. Shanks lowered himself to the ground across from Mihawk with a sigh and a head shake. "Me either. I thought he'd settle back in, but..." "He hates it," Mihawk said. "The sea. Sailing." Shanks's lips quirked in a sad smile. "Some son of a pirate." Mihawk hummed, running his fingers through Zoro's hair. "We'll have to find a new home. Somewhere like Kurigana. The less people to inform the world government, the better. No people at all would be ideal, but the chances of finding a completely abandoned island were slim. Finding Kurigana had been a miracle in itself." Shanks watched him closely, his eyes scanning Zoro. "You think that's what's best for him? I mean, he needs to be around more people, Hawkie." Mihawk looked down at the small boy curled against his chest, one head still wrapped around Wado and the other one clutching Mihawk's shirt. Zoro needed people, or at least to interact with people. His vocabulary needed to expand. Arguably more importantly, Zoro needed to see other children. He needed to know how to be a child. And Mihawk couldn't teach him that. But, he couldn't teach Zoro anything if the Marines caught them. "I wish I knew," Mihawk admitted. "But I know he's not doing well on the ship. And that the Marines will be looking for us." And Zoro was so young. Not even close to old enough to defend himself. Shanks bit his lip, looking between Mihawk and Zoro with obvious uncertainty. On Mihawk's lap, Zoro let out a small whimper and shifted slightly. Mihawk pulled Zoro closer, kissing the top of his head. "It's all right, little tiger," Mihawk assured him, hoping the words would ease whatever nightmare tried to overtake Zoro. With a soft hum, Zoro nestled himself back against Mihawk. A breath of relief left Mihawk. If luck was on their side, Zoro would actually be able to sleep through the night. And so would Mihawk. He would give anything for a real night's sleep. It had been weeks since he managed to rest for more than a few hours. The rest of the ship, he was sure, suffered from a similar problem. Zoro's screams were never quiet, and though the crew had learned to stop coming to check on them, as it only seemed to make Zoro's reactions to the nightmares worse, Mihawk doubted that they slept through the sounds of screaming. "I know an island," Shanks said. Mihawk looked up at him. "What? An island, where you'd be completely alone?" "That would be ideal," Mihawk nodded. "Especially an island the Marines wouldn't think to check." "The Marines won't be able to find you there, Hawkie," Shanks assured him. "Hell, only me and a handful of others know where it is." Mihawk raised an eyebrow. "And how do you know the Marines won't find it eventually?" "Because," Shanks said confidently, "they don't think the island exists." Lush green stood tall against the brown cliffs and the blue skies. Zoro's hand clenched around his pant leg, holding onto him almost as tightly as he held onto Watto. An unusual silence settled over the red-haired pirate's ship. If Mihawk didn't know any better, he'd have called the silence melancholy. But, he suspected, the crew would be more than happy to see him and Zoro off of their ship. Shanks stood on Zoro's other side, staring out at the calm sea between them and the island. Lucky Roo leaned over the railing, staring down at the sea with a look of wonderment. "Cap'n, is this Dash?" "Later, Roo," Shanks said. Zoro's head fell against Mihawk's leg and he looked up, brown eyes filled with a silent question. For a moment, he looked like a normal child, unburdened by trauma or science. Just a curious young boy, uncertain of what sat ahead of him. "Russell?" Zoro whispered. Mihawk's lips pulled up in a soft smile, his fingers brushing a few longer strands of green hair away from Zoro's forehead. "Yes. Russell." Zoro's face lit up. "Russell. Russell." There was no dock on the island, not that Mihawk was surprised. No one lived on the island, no one even knew the place existed Dash, so there was no reason for it to have a dock. Zoro was less than pleased with having to ride the short distance in the boat, but the promise of trees calmed him. There was also no house on the island. Again, Mihawk wasn't surprised. If no one lived on the island, it would make sense that there was no houses on the island. Shanks led him and Zoro through thick trees and past several caves, carefully pointing out where not to go. Curiosity piqued, Mihawk paid close attention to the animal paths that led deeper into the forest. "I mean it, Hawk," Shanks said as they stepped out of the forest. "It's dangerous on those parts. Too dangerous for Zoro. When he's older, I'll take you wherever you want to go." Mihawk couldn't argue with that. Zoro kept his hold on Mihawk's pant leg, eyes scanning the surrounding areas with interest. He didn't move away from Mihawk until they made it out of the trees and into a clearing that overlooked the sea. Zoro's attention found a large tree, not far from the cliff's edge, and Mihawk wasn't fast enough to stop the boy from bolting for the tree. In seconds, Zoro had scrambled up and disappeared among the bright green leaves. Shanks let out a soft laugh as the boy vanished. "That better, little Hawk?" he asked, making his way to stand at the bottom of the tree. The man was either brave or stupid. Leaves rustled and the branches creaked for a moment before Zoro hung down so he could be seen. Mihawk's chest tightened. The smile on Zoro's face was brighter than Mihawk had seen in weeks. His eyes lit up with excitement and there was no sign that he might want to attack Shanks. "Russell," the boy chirped. "Hat. Russell." Shanks laughed. "I thought you'd like that tree. Used to sit at the top with a buddy of mine. It was shorter back then. What do you think, little Hawk? Want your house here?" Mihawk followed Shanks's finger to the cliff's edge. It would give them an unending view of the sea, allowing the sun to rise over the water every morning. It would be beautiful. "And we'll get you and Daddy set up with a garden," Shanks told Zoro, moving his finger closer to the forest, to a flat part of the cliff. "And maybe later a little farm." Amused mischief lit up Shanks's eyes as he winked at Mihawk. "I bet you and Daddy would look cute in matching overalls." "Red hair," Mihawk warned. His cheeks felt unusually warm. Must have been the sun beating down on them. He'd have to remember to get Zoro some sunblock. "Daddy," Zoro chirped. His voice was so high and excited. Mihawk turned to look at his son, finding Zoro's brown eyes lit up and his finger pointing to the spot Shanks wanted to build a house. "Daddy. Home." Any semblance of hesitation fled. Mihawk stared up at his son, basking in the first happiness he'd seen from Zoro since the Admiral arrived. "Home," he agreed. Mihawk wasn't a fan of being sick. Scratch that. He absolutely hated being sick. The world's greatest swordsman being bested by a common cold was a fate more embarrassing than death. Not that he could verbalize that. A single joke of, "You dyin', Hawkeyes," from Yasopp sent Zoro into a sobbing spiral that had taken hours to calm him down from. In an unusual show of foresight, Shanks banished Yasopp back to the ship before Mihawk could cut him in half. Now that Zoro was calm again, happily enjoying his new tree, Mihawk was left in his tent with a pile of tissues and an order to, "Not get us all sick, Hawkie. Rest for God's sake." Easier said than done when they had so much work to do. The weather had been kind so far, warm days with bright sun and slight breezes. But Mihawk knew that wouldn't last forever. And he'd rather be staying in a house than in a collection of tents. The red-haired pirates built a house with their usual amount of urgency. Which was, of course, none. Mihawk sneezed, pressing a tissue to his nose. His head pounded, reminding him that if he moved too quickly that the world would tilt around him. "Where you going, little hawk?" Shanks called from beyond Mihawk's tent walls. "Daddy." "Ah, don't go in there. Daddy's sick. Don't want you catching it." "Daddy." "Zoro." Shanks's voice was firm but not unkind. "You daddy needs to sleep. What do you need?" Silence. And then, "Mum-noms. You're hungry? Mum-noms. All right. Come on, little hawk. Let's get you some food." That was easy. Too easy. But Zoro seemingly pranced away with Shanks without much difficulty. Settling against his pillows, Mihawk thanked whatever entity watched over him that his boy had decided that he liked Shanks once again and closed his eyes. The man was a disaster. A pain in the butt. But there was no one else Mihawk would trust his son with. When he opened his eyes again, the world was dark around him and the only noise he heard was the soft hum of noise from the tent next to him. "Watch the elbow there, little hawk. Those were my ribs. Flip-flap." I know. Oi, settle first, will you? How does Hawky sleep with you flopping around?" Flip-flap. "Shoo, all right. Blankets rustled. How about this one? The tale of Ryoma Katsuro. He's a samurai." "Wado? Huh? Oh, yeah. He uses a sword, like Wado." Zoro hummed his approval so loudly, Mihawk could hear it in his tent. Shanks's laugh followed the hum. Something warm settled into Mihawk's stomach. "All right then, little hawk. In a faraway land, centuries ago. Zoro, it's time for dinner." The leaves rustled, branches shaking and Zoro appears, hanging from the branch by his feet. How he managed to keep Wado from slipping out of her scabbard, Mihawk would never know. "Mum-noms?" Zoro asked. "Fried rice." "Daddy," the boy whined. "We had onigiri Monday. Once a week, Zoro." "Daddy." "Come," Mihawk motioned for Zoro to jump out of the branch. Sulking, the boy leaped down from his branch and followed Mihawk into the house. It was far smaller than their castle had been, more of a shack than a house. Regardless, Mihawk found he liked it. Far easier to clean. And far less places for Zoro to hide. The island, as Shanks had promised, was completely void of people. And no one would ever find them. Not here. Not even the Marines. A paradise only he and Zoro could see. "For now." "Hat?" Zoro asked as he plopped himself down on the floor. "Table," Mihawk told him, gesturing toward one of the chairs. "Shanks and his crew of idiots will surely darken our doorstep soon enough." Like he had for the past several months, Zoro grumbled as he crawled into a chair at the table. At least getting him to the table was easier. Mihawk stared at his son meaningfully as he set down the plate of fried rice and a spoon. Chopsticks were a definite no, Zoro couldn't even use a fork. But, a spoon would hopefully be easier for him. Zoro pouted down at the utensil. "No ting." "You're using the spoon, Zoro." "No. Ting." "Yes." Corners of his mouth stretching down, Zoro stared back at Mihawk for a long moment before he reached his hand down and scooped up a handful of rice, shoving it into his face. Mihawk sighed. Zoro would be the death of him. At least his boy ate the fried rice. Mihawk took his wins where he could get them. Especially when only months before, it was impossible to get Zoro to eat anything other than onigiri. "Hat?" Zoro asked again, kicking his feet in his chair as Mihawk cleaned the table. "I'm not sure when he'll be back, Zoro," Mihawk said again. Zoro's nose pinched in a pout and he crossed his arms over his chest. "Hat." Mihawk rubbed his temples. "Zoro." Purr. "Hat." Mihawk blinked at him. Purr. "I don't understand, Zoro. You need to use more words." Mihawk already knew this was a fight he would lose. Zoro used words when he wanted to. And he used as many words as he felt like and no more. As always, it left Zoro with the distinct want to pull his own hair out. Purr. Zoro hopped off of his chair and made his way to the counter, using the cupboard to clamber up onto it. Then he moved a finger at the transponder snail that sat patiently waiting. Purr. "You." Mihawk paused, trying to ensure that he hadn't misunderstood what his son was telling him. "You want to call Shanks?" Purr. Zoro, you dash." Purr, hat. Purr, daddy. Why on earth would Zoro want to call Shanks? The boy avoided speaking at all unless strictly necessary. And he had to know Shanks would return. The captain had promised to return within the next year, with presents no less. And while Mihawk knew the island was far from any civilization, he had no doubt Shanks would keep that promise. Purr purr. Zoro stood on the counter and stomped his foot. Purr purr. Hat. Purr purr, hat. Zoro, Mihawk said sharply. Do not stomp on the counter. In fact, get down. Purr purr. Dracule Zoro, get down. The tone had the opposite effect. Instead of scrambling down, Zoro flinched and nearly knocked over the transponder snail in an effort to press himself against the wall. The small boy's face twisted in terror, eyes wide. Sheet. Letting out a breath to calm his tense muscles, Mihawk took a step toward his son. Zoro, he cooed softly. Zoro let out a sob. It took seconds for Mihawk to realize why. The front of Zoro's pants soaked through as he pulled his knees up to his chest. No ouch, Zoro whimpered. No ouch. No, Mihawk soothed, making his way to the counter. No, of course not, Zoro. No ouch. Come here. Zoro didn't uncurl himself, but he didn't growl or hiss as Mihawk pulled the boy into his arms. Whimpering softly, Zoro nuzzled his head against Mihawk, nose tickling Mihawk's chin like a cat might. It's all right, Zoro, Mihawk whispered. You're all right. I would never hurt you. Zoro nuzzled closer with a few soft, whining sighs. Let's get you cleaned up, Mihawk said, tucking his arm under Zoro's wet bottom. Then we can call Shanks. No wet? Zoro's voice was barely audible. No wet, Mihawk agreed. We'll use your washcloth. Zoro sniffled softly as Mihawk carefully cleaned him up and dressed him in fresh clothing. Watto remained within arm's length, though Zoro seemed more focused on Mihawk than on the sword for a change. Daddy? Zoro whispered as Mihawk finished pulling the shirt over his head. Yes, little tiger? Zoro leaned into him again, nuzzling under his chin. Mihawk wrapped an arm around his son, pulling him close. Come on, little tiger, Mihawk said, pulling Zoro into his arms as he stood. Let's go call Shanks. Hat, Zoro said quietly. Mihawk settled Zoro on his lap and pulled the den mushi down from the counter. From against his chest, Zoro watched the snail with wide but excited eyes. Hawky? Shanks sounded surprised but not unhappy as he answered the transponder snail. Zoro perked up. Hat. Little hawk. A grin filled Shanks's voice. Now there's a voice I didn't expect. He insisted on calling you, Mihawk said. Demanded, really? Oh? Shanks sounded surprised. Well, what can I do for you, little hawk? Hat. Zoro sounded more serious than Mihawk had ever heard him. Home. Home? Shanks and Mihawk echoed at the same time. Hat. Home. Hawk. The question was easy to hear. What is he telling me? Home, Zoro said again. He would like for you to come see us, Mihawk said. Oh. Shanks sounded surprised. Yeah, of course, little hawk. We'll head your way. Mihawk blinked. The captain agreed too easily, as though it wasn't even a thought for him to change his entire plan on a whim, because Zoro wanted him to. You don't have to come right away, Mihawk assured him. No one's in danger. Hat home. Zoro protested. I think, Mihawk continued, glancing down at the pout on Zoro's face. I think he just misses you. For a moment, Shanks fell completely silent. And then. I miss you guys too, little hawk. Home? Yeah. Of course, Zoro. I'm coming home. Come on, Hawky, Shanks whined, stalking Mihawk into the kitchen. Spar with me. It sounded wonderful. Mihawk hadn't had a proper fight in well over a year, since before Zoro. The Admiral didn't come close to counting, Mihawk hadn't even had a chance to swing his sword. He felt out of practice, Yoru buzzing impatiently and his muscles begging to be used. But it wasn't a good idea. Not with Zoro. Especially after the Admiral fiasco. It had taken so long for Zoro to get comfortable again, so long for Zoro to stop trying to tear apart Shanks and his crew with his teeth. No, Mihawk said. Hawky. Zoro has only recently stopped trying to bite you every time he sees you, Mihawk pointed out. Do you truly think that fighting me will end with you still in his favor? He's not a dumb kid, Hawky. If we explain it to him, he'll be fine. Mihawk raised an eyebrow. The red-haired pirates hadn't even been in his home for a full 24 hours yet and Mihawk already had a headache. And a need for wine. Zoro had been ecstatic to see the ship approaching, running through the house shouting, roar, roar. Hat, Daddy. Hat, roar, for well over an hour. After the initial excitement of the pirates' arrival wore off, Zoro retreated to his tree, happily watching Shanks drive Mihawk up the FING wall. Outside, the red-haired pirates had started a bonfire that was almost as tall as Mihawk's house. The idiots were prancing around it, their voices singing Bink Sake for the 10th time in 6 hours. Briefly, Mihawk wondered if Zoro was sick of the song yet. Come on. We're losing daylight. No, Mihawk repeated. Small footsteps padded across the floor. Zoro scampered in, Watto strapped to his back. His curious brown eyes looked between Mihawk and Shanks, his thin eyebrows scrunched in question. Yes, Zoro, Mihawk said, placing his bottle of wine on the counter. Quishu. Mihawk blinked. Quishu, he echoed the noise. Zoro grinned as he nodded, pulling Watto from his back and shoving the blade to Mihawk. Quishu. Quishu. Shanks looked almost as confused as Mihawk felt. Which made Mihawk feel better. Apparently realizing no one understood what he was trying to say, Zoro let out a disgruntled sigh and shoved Watto toward them again. Quishu. Daddy, hat. Quishu. Quishu. Oh. Shanks grinned smugly as he turned to Mihawk. He wants us to spar. Zoro beamed up at them. Mihawk's jaw almost dropped. He barely managed to keep his composure at Zoro's easy agreement. Don't look so surprised, Hawkeye. Shanks slung an arm over his shoulder. His village is descended from the Wano samurai. Fighting's in his blood. Quishu. Quishu, Daddy. This child was going to be the death of Mihawk. Daddy, Daddy. Zoro's voice carried through the air and into the open window. Mihawk looked up from his book, watching the door as heavy footsteps pounded against the ground. The front door burst open and seconds later, a grinning and filthy 9-year-old stood in front of Mihawk. Hat's here. The young boy cheered. Of course he is. Mihawk's book snapped shut as he stood and looked down at Zoro. He looked like he'd gone mud diving, sticks and leaves sticking out of his hair. Dry mud covered Mihawk's floor from Zoro's bare feet. You need a bath, Mihawk told him. Daddy, Zoro whined. It's hat. I don't care. You're filthy and tracking mud all over the house. Go bathe and then clean up the floor. Cluck. Cluck. Daddy. Cluck. Cluck. Mihawk raised an eyebrow at the boy. Zoro sulked off after a few moments, headed toward the bathroom. Mihawk shook his head. At least he could trust Zoro to bathe himself now. Zoro still wasn't a fan of bathing. He still gave the most disgusted looks whenever Mihawk went to relax in a bubble bath, and he would do everything in his power to only bathe once a week, if possible. But he bathed. It was more than Mihawk could have asked for when he first brought his boy home. Mihawk went straight to the kitchen. Whether he liked it or not, Shanks and his crew of morons would demand food, they always did. Zoro re-emerged only minutes later, mostly scrubbed free of mud and with his hair completely dry. Mihawk fought back a sigh. Thank you, he told his son instead. Zoro, Daddy, meet Hat? Zoro asked, ping his head to the side. They'll come up to us. Daddy, Hat. Mihawk fixed Zoro with a look. Pouting, Zoro rested Watto against his chest and made his way over to the corner near the stove. Shanks had been right when he brought them to the island. The island could be dangerous, the forest full of large animals and man-eating plants. The first few times Mihawk ventured into the forest, Zoro's hand gripped firmly in his son had been completely terrified. Despite how small he was, Zoro clung on hard enough to cut off the circulation in Mihawk's hand. Now, if he took his eyes off Zoro for too long, the boy would wander into the forest and be lost for hours. It would take all of Mihawk's patience and haki to find him. The last time, he'd found Zoro sitting proudly atop the body of a large creature, covered in the beast's blood. Zoro dinner, Daddy, the little boy had chirped happily. Zoro's strength was somewhat terrifying. Though, it was to be expected. The world government wanted something powerful. But they also wanted something controllable. Which, Zoro wasn't. The more comfortable Zoro became, the more wild he ran. Once upon a time, Zoro wouldn't leave Mihawk's side, clinging to his hand and stalking him wherever he went. Mihawk was lucky if he could rope the boy into coming in for dinner. Quishu, Zoro would say, brandishing Watto whenever Mihawk asked him what he was doing in the forest. Zoro, Quishu. Unsurprisingly, the red-haired pirates made no attempt to be quiet. Even if Mihawk hadn't sensed them coming from a mile away, he would have been able to hear them. Their drunken laughter howled on the wind. Which meant that they'd want more food than Mihawk could reasonably make. Zoro perked up at the sound, on his feet and out the door before Mihawk could even turn toward him. Hat! Hat! Shaking his head, Mihawk turned and followed his son out the door. Shanks had bent down, catching Zoro and lifting him up with one arm, by the time Mihawk stepped outside. His brow furrowed slightly at the sight of the captain. Shanks had a cloak drawn around one side, the side Zoro wasn't currently perched on, the way royalty wore their cloaks. It was a strange look for the man, who usually looked as far from put together as Mihawk could picture. But, most noticeably, the man was missing his hat. Which Zoro seemed incredibly upset about. He clambered up onto Shanks's shoulder, patting the top of his head with a frown. Hat, no hat? Zoro's voice dipped in confusion. Shanks's lips quirked in a soft smile. I left it with a friend, Little Hawk. No hat? No, not anymore. Zoro burst into tears. Mihawk jerked in surprise, rushing toward them. The entire crew sobered up immediately, all of them scrambling over themselves to try and comfort the sobbing boy. Oi, oi. Shanks looked at Mihawk, slightly panicked. Zoro, Mihawk said soothingly, gently pulling Zoro into his own arms, feeling just as thrown off as the rest of the crew looked. What's wrong? Squirming in his arms, Zoro reached out for Shanks. His sobs echoed around them, deafening as he cried and wriggled. All right, Little Hawk. Shanks accepted the sobbing child back, still only using one arm. Mihawk's brow furrowed. What have you done to yourself now? He asked with a sigh. Huh? Oof. Zoro collapsed on top of Shanks's shoulder, burying his face in the man's collarbone. Geez, Little Hawk. It's all right. Hawky, what? Mihawk shrugged. On his best days, Zoro was still an enigma Mihawk could never hope to unravel. But this took extreme to an entirely new definition. Come inside, he sighed, shaking his head at the crew. It'll be more comfortable. And you can tell me what you've done to yourself. Shanks looked down at Zoro, concern clear on his face. Maybe that should wait until later, Hawky. They barely managed to calm Zoro down before the young boy realized that Shanks was missing an entire FING arm and collapsed into a fit of fresh tears. Mihawk glared at the redhead as Zoro latched himself onto Shanks's side again, weeping as though the man had died. You didn't think to give me a heads up? Mihawk demanded. Shanks looked down at Zoro, at a loss. I didn't expect him to react like this. Zoro, it's only an arm. Zoro howled in agony. Mihawk pinched the bridge of his nose. Across from them, Beckman leaned against the counter with his arms crossed and an eyebrow raised at his idiot captain. Kid cares about you, Beckman said. You saw what he used to do with Mihawk when one of us touched him. What did you think he was going to do, Captain? Well, not this. Beckman let out a long-suffering sigh. Mihawk echoed the sentiment. Despite the pure stupidity of the rest of his crew, Beckman at least seemed to have somewhat of a head on him. Though, agreeing to call Shanks his captain might have eliminated any hope of brain cells the man pretended to have. Ow, ow, ouch, Zoro wept. Hot. Ouch. Shanks's eyes widened like saucers and Mihawk closed his eyes to pull in a deep breath. Of course. He should have thought. Years ago, he would have. When Zoro was still just a small child that had been freshly dragged out of a lab that had spent God only knew how long experimented on. After 4 years, it had slipped Mihawk's mind. Not that Zoro had been an experiment. No, that horrible realization would be burned into Mihawk's brain for the rest of his life. Mihawk had forgotten that Zoro hadn't been the only child in that horrible place. He was just the only one who survived. How many children had Zoro been forced to watch tortured and taken apart? Mihawk shook the thought from his head and knelt down beside Zoro and Shanks. The warmth of Shanks's body washed over him instantly. The man had always been a space heater, full of warmth and sunshine. Any night they shared a bed ended with Mihawk throwing the blankets off, sweating from more than just their nightly activities. Zoro, Mihawk whispered, reaching out to brush a tear away. Zoro turned to him, snatching his hand and dragging it toward Shanks. Daddy. Ha ha hat, ouch. Ouch. I know. But he's safe, now. He's here with us, little tiger. And no ouch. Hat. That's right. No ouch. Shanks is here with us. And his crew. No one will hurt him. Zoro nuzzled himself against Shanks's chest, sniffling. Shanks's arm tightened around the boy, holding him close. I'm sorry I scared you, Little Hawk, Shanks whispered. I'm all right. No ouch, Zoro muttered, cheeks still wet with tears. No ouch. No ouch, Mihawk and Shanks agreed in unison. So, what happened? Shanks shifted beside him, rolling onto his side to look at Mihawk. But Mihawk refused to look at him. He couldn't. It hurt. Not that he would ever be able to admit that out loud. He couldn't have the idiot pirate captain looking further into this than it was, a mutual arrangement between two lonely souls who could occasionally find solace in one another's arms. Mihawk couldn't have Shanks thinking that he had feelings beyond tolerance. For Zoro's sake, of course. The young boy was so attached to Shanks, made even more obvious by Zoro's extreme reaction to Shanks's missing limb. It hurt to know that Zoro was hurt because of Shanks's injury. And because, maybe, Mihawk could have stopped it from happening. So he didn't lose his sparring partner. There weren't many men Mihawk found an interesting duel in and now he couldn't even have an even fight with Shanks. Now, it felt as though Mihawk had no one to be equal with. No one to grow stronger with. You inspired me, I guess, Shanks said after a long pause. Mihawk raised an eyebrow at him. I what? You inspired me, the redhead repeated, the fingers of his remaining hand tracing along Mihawk's collarbone. He fought not to shudder under the warm touch. I bet on the next generation. The next generation? There's this kid in the East Blue. He's a crazy little brat. Says he's going to be king of the pirates. And, you know what, Hawkie? I believe him. That kid is going to be king of the pirates. He's gonna take Roger's crown and wear it better than the old man ever did. Mihawk hummed his interest. Sound like an interesting boy. You have no idea. Shanks launched into the tale of this Luffy child, laughing about the child eating a devil fruit out of pure anger at Shanks and then getting himself thrown into the ocean. He laughed about the Sea King that tried to eat the boy and how Beckman pulled both of them out of the water like puppies that had been caught with their heads in the garbage can. And then he laughed about the fact that the DMN kid was a Vice Admiral's grandson. And not use any Vice Admiral. Garp the hero. Shanks had somehow managed to get himself involved with Garp the hero's grandson. Mihawk shouldn't have been surprised. The BSTRD didn't have an ounce of self-preservation. Despite Mihawk voicing his concern, Shanks only laughed again. The sound was light and easy, Shanks's laugh. It filled the room, chasing anyway any lingering concern that the man might have changed. Shanks's eyes lit up when they met Mihawk's, happy and content. I think Zoro would like him, Shanks whispered after a minute. Oh? And do you plan on kidnapping a child and bringing him through the Grand Line? Shanks hesitated. It gave Mihawk an underlying sense of doom. Shanks never hesitated. The idiot was blunt, unflinching, and unapologetic. No, Shanks said after a moment. I thought, maybe, you and Zoro could try sailing with us again. Mihawk's brow furrowed. Zoro hates sailing. He did, Shanks agreed. After we had to traumatically rip him out of his home. Maybe he'll like it better now. It's worth a shot, ain't it, Hawkie? Was it? Zoro was finally happy. Thriving, in a way. The boy ran all over the island by himself, without whining or needing Mihawk. He was growing stronger and more confident. I know that he's doing good here, Shanks said quickly. But, he's not. He doesn't know how to be a kid, Hawkie. Of course he doesn't, Mihawk said sharply. He was locked in a lab for God knows how long and since then the only ones he's been around have been adults. Other than yourself and your bunch of, oh. Shanks's lips quirked in half a smile as Mihawk cut himself off. Zoro didn't know how to be a child. He looked over his shoulder and never played games. He still didn't, either couldn't or refused to speak in any semblance of a sentence. And social interactions, outside of Shanks's crew, Mihawk was sure would be a complete disaster. You got a good kid, Shanks said gently. But someone's gotta teach him how to be a kid. Mihawk hated it when Shanks was right. The 2-month voyage went far better than Mihawk expected it to. With the promise of returning home whenever he desired, Zoro was far more willing to board Shanks's ship. He continued to cling to Watto, as he did whenever he visited a new place, but he didn't try to stab any of the crew with it, so Mihawk allowed him to keep the blade. Unsurprisingly, Shanks's crew of lazy drunks went out of their way to make it the best experience possible. Beckman took Zoro up to the crow's nest, which quickly became the boy's new favorite spot. Roar Russell, Daddy. Roar Russell. And Lucky Roo spoiled him with onigiri, much to Mihawk's displeasure. Not that anyone on the ship listened to Mihawk's displeasure. Least of all, the captain. Let them spoil him, Hawk. Shanks would wave a dismissive hand. They like being around kids. Zoro didn't mind getting off for supply runs, though he insisted on clutching Mihawk's hand, eyes searching for any trace of danger. Shanks stuck close as well, pointing different things out to Zoro on each island they stopped at. Each island they returned with bags of clothing, books, and other things for Zoro to enjoy. Let me spoil him, Hawk. Shanks waved a dismissive hand when Mihawk tried to protest all the things Shanks bought his son. I missed my little Hawk. By the 3rd island, Zoro started holding Shanks's hand as well. It all felt so disgustingly domestic. Zoro holding both of their hands with Watto tied safely on his back as they walked through the village together. Dawn Island was a small, forgettable jungle island set away in the East Blue. It wasn't an island Mihawk would have ever visited without Shanks's suggestion. Heads turned in their direction as they pulled into port, Zoro hanging on the railing to watch. Russells, Daddy, he cheered. Lots and lots of Russells. Don't go far, Mihawk ordered, patting his head. Stay where you can be seen. Zoro grinned, hopping off the ship and running to the closest tree. Shaking his head, Mihawk turned back to Shanks. Docking never took long, but convincing the captain to go anywhere other than a bar did. He was bound and determined to go straight to Party's bar. Which was no place for Zoro to be. It was a miracle he'd left the ship by himself. Dragging him into a room full of nothing but drunks was the worst idea Shanks's had ever had. Hawkie, that's where we'll find Luffy, I'm sure of it. or where you'll find your next dash. Oi! A child screeched from somewhere in the village. Give that back. Something prickled across the back of his neck. Mihawk's spine shuddered. Zoro. Moving quickly. Racing toward them. He spun on his heel, hand already moving to Yoru as Zoro burst through the small crowd of people and leapt onto the ship with something yellow in his hand. I said give that back. Another child was just behind him, red smearing down his face from his bloody nose, and running for all he was worth. Though he skidded and tripped, as though he'd never run before. In the blink of an eye, the boy leapt onto the ship. Zoro climbed Shanks like a tree, arm wrapped around the redheads in a bruising grip, and he hissed down at the younger boy, spittle flying everywhere. Give that back or I'm gonna kick your butt, the boy screamed. Still growling and hissing like an angry cat, Zoro plopped the yellow hat in his hand down on Shanks's head. Luffy, Shanks choked out. Mihawk's gaze flickered from the angry boy on the deck, his son hissing like an enraged tiger, and Shanks slowly turning red. Rubbing his temples, Mihawk sighed. So much for making friends. Zoro kept himself pressed tightly to Daddy's side and glared at the other boy. Hat patted the boy's head, returning the yellow straw hat to the boy's black hair. Zoro hated him. It was Hat's hat. It was Hat's like Watto was Zoro's. Nobody else got to have it. Daddy's fingers scratched at the top of Zoro's head, like it could distract him from the fact that the boy was taking Hat's hat, again. After all the trouble Zoro went to get it back for him. But it wasn't going to distract Zoro. He was going to get Hat's hat back. Zoro barely moved before Daddy's arm wrapped around his waist and pulled him back to the couch. No, Daddy told him. He used the angry voice, the way he sounded when Zoro followed the wind without asking. And Zoro knew it didn't mean ouchs. Daddy always said, no ouch. No more ouchs. Zoro hunkered down on the couch again, just in case. Daddy wouldn't give him ouchs. And Hat wouldn't either. But what about the boy? Would the boy give ouchs? Zoro didn't remember it well. He didn't remember a lot from before he lived with Daddy, but he remembered that other boys the same size as him, could give ouchs. What if he gave Daddy ouchs? Or Hat? What if he took Hat's hat after he gave him the big arm ouch? Zoro growled at the boy as he yelled at Hat. Daddy's arm tightened around him. Zoro, Daddy said in the angry voice again. Hat finally turned toward them. He smiled at Zoro. It was a happy look, too happy for the boy to give ouchs. But the boy had Hat's hat. And Hat came back, missing his hat, with a big ouch. Pushing the boy forward, Hat walked up to Zoro and Daddy. Zoro, Hat said, kneeling down. I want you to meet a friend of mine. This is Luffy. Zoro glanced at the boy, Luffy. He stared back at Zoro, red drying on his top lip, with his head pegged to the side. Hi, Luffy said after a long quiet. Zoro looked up at Daddy. It's all right, Zoro, Daddy said. Not sure of what he was supposed to do, Zoro turned back to look at the boy. Shanks said that you don't know anybody, Luffy said. That you're all alone. Want to be my friend? Friend? Zoro furrowed his brow at the boy. The word sounded familiar, like someone had said it before. But he didn't know what it meant. Zoro looked up at Daddy. What does that mean, Daddy? Daddy's fingers scratched Zoro's scalp again. A friend, Daddy repeated. Like Shanks is my friend. Like Hat? Zoro turned to look back at the boy. The boy was offering to be his hat. Did Zoro need another hat? Daddy had his own hat. Was Zoro supposed to have one too? Luffy seemed kind of like a hat. He was strong like Hat. Zoro hit him as hard as he could. The man in the white coat used to fall over when Zoro hit him as hard as he could. But Luffy didn't fall over. He smiled like Hat too, big and wide. Did Zoro need another hat? Looking at Luffy again, Zoro nodded. He could try to have a hat. And, if Zoro didn't like him, he'd take Hat's hat back, just like he took Watto back from the white coat. Then he and Daddy and Hat could leave on the roar with Hat's hat. Hat grinned. Zoro looked up at Daddy and he could see that Daddy smiled a little too. So, Zoro was supposed to have his own hat. Eyeing Luffy again, Zoro nodded to himself. He could do that. He could keep a hat. Shanks was way too content to let the children wander on their own. Zoro looked only mildly nervous to leave on his own with Luffy, the wild child yelling about adventures and pirates and a whole host of things that Mihawk wasn't sure about, but he left. Mihawk was somehow equal parts relieved that someone could show Zoro how to be a child and horrified at the idea of taking his eyes off of Zoro. Let him be a kid, Hawky, Shanks said lazily, tipping a bottle back to his lips. Easier said than done when this particular kid was something the Marines wanted their hands on. Badly, if the old photo of Zoro was anything to go by. 9 years old and already worth so much. Mihawk hadn't seen a bounty poster for a child since the little demon girl from O'Hara. Oni, Dracule Zoro. Demon. As though Zoro was anything other than a traumatized child that the world government had created. How utterly ridiculous. The picture was old, likely from the case file that Shanks found on the marine ship years ago. Zoro looked around 4 or 5, his green hair short and choppy, as though someone had taken a knife to the messy green locks. And he snarled at the camera, his lip pulled back to reveal his angry, yellow canines. "Oh, quit staring at it, Hawkie," Shanks said, pulling the poster from his hand. "You're getting worked up for nothing. Luffy'll take care of Zoro." "That is nowhere near as comforting as you think it is," Mihawk growled, sipping his wine. Luffy seemed kind, but he also seemed like a wild child. And Shanks had a particularly interesting affinity for befriending the strangest of people. The red-haired pirates dissolved into a party, unsurprisingly. At least the barmaid seemed to think it was charming. Mihawk was less charmed and more tired. He'd heard these songs hundreds of times on their voyage. Zoro loved his la-las. His nightly demands meant the ship was full of singing for hours on end. And Mihawk was absolutely sick of hearing Bink Sake. Leaning his head back, Mihawk relaxed into his chair. The time ticked by slowly and he kept his eyes on the path into and out of town. Luffy had pulled Zoro down that very path on their way toward his house. Zoro went willingly, if not a bit unsure. And Zoro was strong. Mihawk knew that. He faced down creatures 4 times his size in the forest on their island, killing them without difficulties. Whatever was on this island wouldn't be an issue for him. Still, Mihawk couldn't shake the hum of something under his skin. It was an unfamiliar feeling, one he rarely felt. When he described the feeling to Hongo, the doctor had laughed, clapped him on the shoulder and told him it was called anxiety. Which seemed utterly ridiculous. Mihawk didn't get anxious. He was the world's greatest swordsman. Nothing made him anxious. Well, except maybe his son wandering through an unknown island alone. With the grandson of a Vice Admiral. That might make Mihawk nervous. Not that he was going to admit that to anyone. Especially not to Shanks. The BSTRD would tease him until the end of days. "Hawkie," Shanks whined. Shaggy red hair tickled Mihawk's cheek. Shanks leaned closer, pouting pointedly at him. "Parents are supposed to relax and party when their kids aren't around." "That is incorrect," Mihawk replied sharply. "Hawkie." The scent of sake washed over him. "Drink more wine and relax. Zoro's making friends." Zoro punched your young acquaintance in the face. And Luffy thought he was awesome. "I thought the idea of this was to teach Zoro how to be a normal child. Luffy seems as feral as Zoro." Shanks had the nerve to laugh. "Normal's overrated. Luffy'll teach him how to play and use his imagination." Shanks's shoulder knocked against his. "He'll teach Zoro some independence." Mihawk balked at him. "Zoro has plenty of independence. He killed a forest beast by himself just last week." Shanks laughed. "Of course he did. But that's what I meant. I meant, Luffy'll teach him how to be independent from you." "From me?" Shanks nodded. "Yeah. He's a tough little guy, smart as a whip too. But, he relies on you too much. I'm his father. You don't have to challenge him anymore. Half the time, the crew and I don't understand a word he says. But he just has to look at you and you know what he wants. And that's great for when he needs to be safe, but," Shanks shrugged, "you're his comfort zone." Mihawk blinked. Comfort zone. It shouldn't have been a foreign word. For years, Zoro had run to him for protection. For love and for comfort. But, he'd never thought of it as a negative. Had he stopped pushing Zoro? Probably. At some point, he started compromising. Zoro refused to use proper words or speak in full sentences, but he ate more than onigiri and slept in his own bed. And that had been enough. But it shouldn't have been. Zoro wasn't a normal child, but that didn't mean Mihawk should compromise. And, Shanks continued, he's your comfort zone. So, Luffy's teaching Zoro how to function without Daddy. And I am teaching Daddy how to function without Zoro. Mihawk's cheeks heated. Shanks cackled. The red-haired BSTRD loved to poke where he could. Hot breath rolled over Mihawk's neck as Shanks leaned closer. "Come on, Daddy. Let's learn some independence." Zoro kept Watto tight in his hands. Daddy waited in the sake room with Hat and all of Hat's crew while Zoro followed Luffy through the dirt walks. He wished Daddy or Hat would have come too. Not seeing them felt bad, like when he used to sit in the chair and wait for the wet. Last time he couldn't see Daddy, something bad happened. Zoro didn't really remember it. There was lots of yelling and a yellow man that moved faster than anyone else. All he wanted was Daddy. All he wanted was for the yellow man to go away and never come back. Then there was a big boom and the man was gone. But Daddy wouldn't wake up and every little noise made Zoro's hair stand on end. He stopped, looking back at the tops of the houses near the water. "Zoro," Luffy called from a little further up the dirt trail. "Come on. Hurry up." Zoro clucked his tongue at the smaller boy. He didn't know if he liked Luffy. Daddy and Hat wanted him to, but Luffy was loud and he took Hat's hat. Zoro. Luffy whined. He should go back to Daddy. The little hum under his skin meant he needed to go back to Daddy. Daddy was too far away. That meant that Zoro wasn't safe and that Daddy wasn't safe. A sudden warmth appeared next to him. Zoro moved away instantly, curling his lip back in warning. Whoever was next to him needed to know, Zoro would bite them and it would hurt. Zoro could be scary too. Luffy didn't look scared. He pet his head to the side and looked back at the housetops too. Shanks is with Mihawk, Luffy told him. And Shanks is the strongest in the whole world. Until I get stronger. Then I'll be the strongest in the whole world. Hat was strong. Zoro knew that. But Hat wasn't strong enough to stop the yellow man. You wanna go back? Luffy asked. Zoro blinked and turned to him. The other boy didn't sound angry. Not even the not angry, like Daddy sounds when Zoro won't use the ting to eat. And Zoro hadn't said anything at all. Even with Daddy, Zoro had to tell him things. Luffy grinned. We can have adventures in town. I know where all the good meat is. We'll get it on the way. Zoro pet his head to the side, staring at Luffy. Come on, Luffy said, offering Zoro's his hand. We gotta get meat. Then we'll go back to Shanks and Mihawk. Back to Hat and Daddy. Zoro nodded. Sweet fruit. He tasted like sweet fruit. Not that Mihawk was surprised. Shanks had a fondness for the sweeter sakes, guzzling them down until his cheeks were red and his eyes were bright with mischief. Shanks broke their kiss first, his single hand tangling in Mihawk's hair as his lips attached themselves to Mihawk's neck instead. His tongue was wet and freeing, like the nip of Shanks' teeth was enough to knock away all the unease that had been building in Mihawk's body since Zoro left his sight. It was an intoxicating feeling. Mihawk had spent years holding Shanks at an arm's distance for that very reason. The captain had a dangerous power, one that no one other than Zoro had ever mastered. He had the power to make Mihawk love. Not that Mihawk would ever admit that, to anyone. Love was a dangerous thing. It made people weak. It made them predictable. In their lives, predictable was death. Mihawk and death were old nemesis and he had no intentions of losing to the BSTRD anytime soon. Shanks's fingers drifted down to Mihawk's trousers, tugging softly. Little help? Mihawk's hands moved without thought, tugging his pants down. The BSTRD had the ability to make his mind go blank, his body moving at Shanks's will. With a hum of approval and hunger, Shanks vanished from in front of him, dropping to his knees. His mouth was warm and wet, tongue swirling. Mihawk hummed. His fingers found Shanks's hair. It was soft. How could it be so fing soft when they'd spent so long at sea? His hair was just long enough that Mihawk could twirl the locks around his fingers. Shanks sounded as wet as he felt, slobbering and slurping as he moved around Mihawk. It wasn't fair how quickly and easily the man could make Mihawk come undue, miming like a were, his hips moving to meet Shanks's tongue. Looking down, he found Shanks watching him, cheeks puffed out and lips stretched around him with a smug smirk. Reading the face wasn't hard. Shanks taunted him. It hadn't even been 5 minutes and Mihawk was closer than he was proud to admit. Tightening his hold on Shanks's hair, he pulled the other man off his D, and glowered down at him. Shanks grinned, a sheet-eating grin full of mischief and challenge. Mihawk would make him regret the challenge. Yanking the younger man up, Mihawk captured Shanks's lips in his own. The taste of sake remained, lightly tinged with sweat and pre-cum. In Shanks's mouth, it tasted like heaven. They fell onto the bed in a tangle of limbs, Shanks somehow managing to clambering on top of Mihawk. Their mouths remained locked together, teeth clacking in their haste and desperation. Shanks's warmth pressed down on him, the BSTRD rocking softly against Mihawk's hardened pages. Mihawk grasped Shanks's length, tugging softly in response. Shanks hummed his approval into Mihawk's mouth. Shanks broke the kiss first, looming over Mihawk with lust sparkling in his eyes. I'm going to ride you so fing dash. The door squeaked open. Daddy? Mihawk launched Shanks off of him at the sound of his son's voice. The captain landed with an "umph" as Mihawk pulled the sheet over his naked body and sat up. Zoro stood in the doorway, beside Luffy, head ped to the side in confusion and Watto leaning against his shoulder. Luffy mirrored the look. Ow, Hawky, Shanks muttered, sitting up so that his head peeked over the top of the bed. Oh, hey, Anchor. Hey, little hawk. Zoro's eyebrows scrunched. Hat, Daddy, bath? Bath? Shanks echoed. Zoro nodded, pulling at his own shirt. No cover. Hat, Daddy, bath. Mihawk's face felt like it was on fire. Yes, he nodded at his son. Yes, we're going to take bath. Shanks burst out laughing. Mihawk was going to kill him. Zoro, bath? Zoro asked, inching into the room. Mihawk blinked. You want to take a bath? Zoro took another step into the room. Zoro, stay Daddy. His voice shook slightly, tears sparkling in his gaze. Mihawk sat up straighter, offering an arm. "What's wrong, little tiger?" Zoro crawled onto the bed, his foot nearly crushing Mihawk's softening Irkton. "Zoro, stay daddy. He wanted to come back to you and Shanks," Luffy chirped. "I told him we can play here." Without warning, the little boy shot over the bed and tackled Shanks to the ground. "Fight me." Zoro turned to hiss at Luffy again as the boy and Shanks hit the ground. Mihawk felt a headache coming on. Beckman kept laughing, even as he carried Zoro and Luffy to the bar. Makino promised Luffy a big dinner in exchange for him not destroying any more of her furniture at the bar, and the young boy demanded that Zoro and the crew join him. Despite Zoro's insistence that he would bathe with Mihawk and Shanks, Mihawk really rathered that his son didn't have to see any more of Shanks's naked body than he already had. Shanks kept laughing too, finding Mihawk's embarrassment entirely too entertaining. Mihawk shut him up the best way he knew how. Shanks enjoyed being thrown into the shower wall entirely too much. They picked up where they left off, Shanks looking all too beautiful with his face pressed into the wall. "Maybe he'll knock from now on," Shanks said, toweling off his hair. Mihawk scoffed, pulling on his pants. "Idiot. He doesn't even know what we were doing. He doesn't know what SEC is." Shanks looked baffled. "He doesn't? He's 9. I think." The paperwork Shanks found on Zoro didn't have a birth date, but Mihawk guessed the boy was around 5 when he found him, and it had been 4 years now. "Almost 10, Mihawk realized after a moment. "It's October, isn't it?" Shanks nodded. "You know his birthday?" Mihawk shook his head. "We just celebrate the day I brought him home. November 11th. We'll throw him a big birthday party," the captain said with a grin. "There's a swordsmith in the village. I'm sure he'll have a few accessories." Mihawk raised an eyebrow. "Accessories?" Shanks nodded, pulling on his shirt. "We could get him a sword frog, so he doesn't have to tie Watto on his back with string. Or pick him up his own cleaning kit. Or maybe another sword." "He's 9, Mihawk stressed. "He doesn't need more than one sword." "You can't have too many swords," Shanks told him, leading him back toward the bar. "You can," Mihawk sighed. 3 swords is too many swords. Most people only have 2 hands." Shanks continued to ramble about all of the things they could get for Zoro to celebrate his birthday. Ahead of them, a man dragged a crying girl out of the bar. "Papa, I want it," she cried. "Papa." Not for the first time, Mihawk was incredibly grateful that Zoro was a relatively quiet. He rarely threw tantrums, and, once he settled into traveling outside the ship and the house, people almost never spared them a second glance. The red-haired pirates were in full party mode when they walked in. Music and laughter filled the bar. Luffy danced around with Yasopp while Zoro sat at the bar with Beckman, watching with intent interest. "Daddy," Zoro chirped happily, crawling into Mihawk's lap when he sat down at the bar. "Hello, little tiger. Have you eaten?" "Zoro, noms?" Mihawk looked down at the plate sitting on the bar and picked up the wine Makino offered him. "There's rice in this, Zoro." "Noms, daddy." Mihawk sighed. "No. I can make him some," Makino offered. "If you can tell me what they are." "Rice ball," Shanks said, taking Zoro's empty seat between Beckman and Mihawk. "He loves the things. He doesn't need rice ball, he can eat what he's been given." "Daddy," Zoro whined. "No." Pouting out his lower lip, Zoro turned to look at Shanks. "Papa, noms." Mihawk choked on his wine. It burned his nose, sending him into a coughing fit. Beside him, Shanks spit out the entire gulp of sake he'd taken. "Papa?" Shanks echoed as Mihawk tried to stop coughing. Zoro nodded, a serious look on his face. He stood on Mihawk's lap, leaning over to pat Shanks's head. "No hat. Papa." Beckman snickered around his beer. Shanks blinked, his questioning gaze moving to Mihawk, as though asking for permission. As though Mihawk had any control over what Zoro called people. He couldn't even get the boy to ask for onigiri instead of noms. "Papa." Zoro patted Shanks's head again. "Noms." "Don't," Mihawk ordered before Shanks could speak. He could see the man's will weakening. "Daddy said no, Zoro. Papa doesn't get to say yes." Zoro pouted. Shanks smiled. "Look, a beetle." Luffy grabbed Zoro's arm and pulled him over to look at the bug as it crawled across the ground. Mihawk couldn't help but smile. Zoro peered down at the beetle with slight interest, even leaning down to poke at it. "Told you," Shanks said, elbow nudging Mihawk's side as they watched Luffy ramble about how cool the beetle was and Zoro nod along. Mihawk didn't want to admit that the captain had been right, but in only a month he already saw a difference. Zoro still didn't wander far from him or Shanks, always demanding that at least one of them be within earshot. But, he was more willing to follow Luffy around town. He even seemed to find his own interest in things other than swords and climbing trees. Daddy, look! Zoro appeared with the beetle in his hand. Papa, beetle! Shanks smiled, ruffling Zoro's hair. That's a good-looking bug, little hawk. Grinning, Zoro turned back to Luffy and the boys scurried off to return the beetle. It was a wide grin, one that lit up Zoro's entire face. Mihawk had seen the grin more in the last 2 weeks than he had in the entire 4 years Zoro had lived with him. He looked 9 years old. Shanks, Mihawk said, his eyes locked on his son as Luffy pulled him to look at the next cool bug. How long do you think we can stay? Daddy. Daddy. Hands shook him awake. Mihawk hummed, shoving Zoro's hands away from him and rolled onto his other side. Zoro let out a huff and his little feet raced around to the other side of the bed. Papa. 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 Hawky, Shanks groaned, the bed shifting as the captain moved. Your kid wants you. Before sunrise, Mihawk muttered, burying his head in the pillow, he's your kid. A weight landed on them, half on Mihawk and half on Shanks. Every bit of breath left Mihawk's lungs as Zoro wriggled around, shaking all 3 of them. Daddy, Papa. Luffy. Luffy, please. Zoro, Shanks groaned. The sun isn't even up yet. Anchor's asleep. Cluck. Cluck. Luffy. Zoro, Mihawk hummed, snatching the boy and pulling him into the bed, under the covers. You can see Luffy once he's awake. But he's asleep. Right dash. Zoro. Oi. Zoro. Zoro wriggled up at the sound of Luffy's shouts, pressing through the ship's walls and demanding the attention of the entire crew. Luffy, he yelled back. Mihawk hummed. Do something with your children, he told Shanks. Luffy's footsteps rushed through the ship. Mihawk braced himself as he heard the door fly open. Seconds later, Luffy's weight crashed onto the bed. Luffy. Zoro chirped happily. Anchor, Shanks muttered. The sun isn't even awake yet. Zoro I want to go find beetles. Can you not do that in the morning? Mihawk muttered. Some of them don't come out when the sun is up, Luffy told him. Daddy, Zoro said, his small hands gripping Mihawk's arm and shaking him softly. Beetles. Up, Daddy. Up. Little hawk, Shanks groaned. We're sleeping. Beetles, Papa, Zoro protested. You can go look for beetles, Shanks said. Daddy and I are sleeping. Daddy? Zoro sees beetles. Mihawk hummed his approval. As long as he could go back to sleep, Mihawk was fine with Zoro exploring with Luffy. The boys had been wandering around together for weeks. And, while Luffy had done little to help Zoro learn civilized behaviors, he still couldn't convince his son to use utensils, or the social skills Mihawk had hoped for. The young devil fruit user had inarguably taught Zoro the independence Shanks spoke of. Beetles, Luffy. The 2 boys scrambled off the bed. Waves, Daddy. Waves, Papa. Bye, little hawk. Back for breakfast, Mihawk called as the 2 boys vanished down the corridor. Beside him, Shanks shifted closer, warmth pressing into Mihawk's body as his arm snaked around Mihawk's waist and his head nestled against Mihawk's collarbone. Letting out a content breath, Mihawk closed his eyes and let sleep take him again. Zoro followed Luffy through the winding dirt walks, keeping a close eye on the ground to look for beetles. Luffy likes the beetles like Zoro liked Watto. All the shiny colors made Luffy smile big. And Zoro liked that smile. It made his chest bubbly and warm. At first Zoro wasn't sure if he liked the feeling. He thought that maybe something was wrong with him. Maybe he was going to scream like Kuina after the ouchs. She had clutched her chest too. She had screamed for help. Zoro didn't want to forever sleep like Kuina. But Daddy said it was a good thing. He said the bubbly warm meant he was happy. That sometimes, Daddy felt the bubbly warm too. And Daddy would never lie to Zoro. It was hard to see at beetles in the dark, but Zoro tried. He made sure to keep his eyes focused on the ground, searching for the little crawlies that would make Luffy smile and feel the bubbly warm too. Zoro, Luffy said. Let's go into the forest? There's lots of beetles in there. Zoro looked at the sea of rustles ahead of them. They always stayed close to Daddy and Papa. Zoro didn't like being too far away from Daddy. It made him feel cold. But he was with Luffy and Luffy always made him feel bubbly warm. He and Luffy protected each other. And Papa protected Daddy. Zoro nodded. Luffy grinned, wide, like Papa did every time Zoro called him Papa. Like he was feeling lots of bubbly warm. They found lots of beetles in the rustles. Luffy smiled the whole time and Zoro felt warm, like he'd never be cold again. The glow started to light up the rustles. It made pretty shapes on the ground that moved when the wind did. Zoro liked to watch them dance. It was like when he got to watch Daddy Quishu with other people. It moved pretty and careful, never stumbling the way Zoro did with Watto. A very pretty dance moved beside a big rustle. Zoro sat at the bottom of the rustle, watched the dark spots dance while Luffy climbed up to look for beetles. Watto leaned against Zoro's shoulder, humming the way Daddy hummed when he and Zoro sat still and quiet before bed. Luffy dropped down beside him after a minute. "I didn't find any," Luffy said. "And I'm hungry. Breakfast." Putting Watto back on his back, Zoro sprang to his feet. Luffy started skipping down the dirt walk and Zoro was about to follow him when the wind whispered. There were no words, but Zoro could feel it. The wind always whispered where it wanted him to go. Most of the time, Zoro didn't listen because Daddy said Zoro had to stay with him. But Daddy wasn't with him right now, so Zoro should get to follow the wind. And the wind really wanted him to go. It promised that Luffy would feel really bubbly warm if Zoro followed. And Zoro wanted Luffy to feel bubbly warm. He turned away from Luffy, following the wind as it told him where to go. "Zoro!" Luffy called behind him. "Oi, Zoro! Wait!" Zoro didn't wait. The wind didn't want him to wait. The wind promised that Luffy would be really bubbly warm if Zoro kept following it. So he did. "Zoro!" Luffy yelled. He ran after Zoro. "That's the wrong way." Zoro shook his head. "Wind. The wind wants us to go this way." Luffy's eyebrows scrunched up but he followed Zoro and the wind. The dirt walk disappeared from beneath Zoro's feet but the wind promised that they just had to keep going. It pulled Zoro onward, toward something that would make Luffy bubbly warm. Sticks cracked and the grass grumbled as Zoro walked, following the wind over rotting trees and big rocks. Luffy trailed behind him, occasionally asking where they were going. Each time, Zoro could only shrug. He didn't know where they were going. Only the wind knew. The night light peeked through the leaves. Ahead, pretty colors shone against the dark Russell's trunks. "Beetles!" Luffy cheered. He shot past Zoro, grinning. Zoro followed after him, pausing beside the colors. They were beetles. In the dark, they sparkled like a bunch of diamonds. Or like Watto after Zoro and Daddy cleaned her really good. "Pretty," Zoro said. "Real pretty." Luffy agreed, snatching one of the beetles off the trunk. "Look at the colors." There was lots of them, more than Zoro could even name. "How'd you know where to find the beetles?" Luffy asked, still smiling widely as he held the beetle. "Wind said." Luffy blinked. Zoro waited him for say the wind didn't talk, like Daddy always did. But he laughed instead. "That's so cool. Hawky, you're going to pace a hole in the floor." Mihawk didn't pause, but he glared at Shanks. The sun sat midway up the sky. Breakfast had come and gone. And there was no sign of Luffy or Zoro. They were fine. Mihawk could feel them in the woods, running around without a care in the world. Zoro wasn't hurt and he wasn't injured. There was nothing to worry about. And yet, Mihawk's stomach clenched uncomfortably. Why had they gone into the forest? A forest that bordered on a jungle. Not that it mattered much. Whatever lived in the jungle paled in comparison to the beasts Zoro killed back home. But they never wandered out of the town. Zoro had never been this far away before. It wouldn't take Mihawk long to make it to the boys if they were in danger. He knew that. But they were still so far away. Shanks groaned. "It's a good thing, Hawk. Zoro's exploring, like a normal kid. That's what you wanted." "Just because it's what I wanted does not mean I'm comfortable with it." Mihawk was more than aware that the sentence made no sense. But he had no other way of expressing it. Mihawk wanted Zoro to be a child. He wanted his son to be confident and strong. But now that it was happening, he'd never been less prepared for anything in life. "Luffy'll take care of him." "That is not as comforting as you believe it is." Shanks had the nerve to smirk. "Zoro's a tough kid. And you're a tough man. He's fine. And you can breathe. Independence, Hawky." Independence was overrated. Shanks's hand snatched Mihawk's as he passed, pulling him to a stop. Mihawk glared down at the captain. Shanks only grinned as he stood. The man was only a centimeter taller than him but it infuriated Mihawk every time he had to move his eyes up to look at Shanks. As if knowing the thought crossed his mind, Shanks's grin widened. His breath tickled Mihawk's face. It was warm. The soft scent of sake lingered between them, as it always did when Shanks was involved. Breathing in Shanks's smell was intoxicating and infuriating. Shanks was a pirate that spent his days at sea. Unlike Mihawk, he had no island that he regularly returned to. He always smelled of sake, sweat, and the sea. It should have been a stench that made Mihawk's stomach crawl, not an aroma that drew Mihawk in closer. Shanks's head dropped, just half a centimeter. His lips were so close, Mihawk could feel their warmth. He could taste the sweetness of Shanks's tongue. "Independence," Shanks drawled again. The captain stared into Mihawk's eyes, waiting. Waiting for Mihawk to give in. Waiting for Mihawk to surge forward and capture him in a kiss. Like a needy were. Like he so desperately wanted to. But that was giving in. That was giving Shanks power. More power than Mihawk could afford to give him. He'd already given Shanks so much power. He sailed on the captain's ship, shared the captain's bed, and he'd trusted the captain with the most important thing in the world, his son. Giving Shanks any more power would mean there was no turning back. Something, deep in his stomach, urged him to give in. To give Shanks all the power he desired and to let himself fall into the people who seemed to be more than willing to accept him, in ways no one had before. Mihawk imagined it would be warm. He imagined it was a feeling, a high that he'd never known. And a high that he would never be able to keep. How hard would the crash be? Not as hard as losing Zoro would be. But it would be close. Always in control, Hawky, Shanks whispered. Mihawk had to be. Those out of control are only doomed to die. Shanks's body crashed into Mihawk's. Sweet, wet lips caught his, teeth clamping down on Mihawk's lower lip. Shanks's arm wrapped around him, holding him secure and dragging him to the bed. We found it. Luffy cheered, tumbling out of the trees and onto the path. He turned to look back at Zoro, grinning up at his friend. Twigs stuck out of Zoro's hair and there was a bit of dirt smudged across his face, but he looked just as happy as Luffy. Seeing the nighttime beetles had been so cool, but Luffy was starving. So he really hoped that, even though Mihawk and Shanks were probably annoyed with them, the adults would feed them as soon as they got back. Zoro's dad didn't really like it when they went too far. He got really weird. Zoro used to get really weird too. The first time Luffy brought him away from Shanks and Mihawk, Zoro had gotten all teary-eyed and scared. But now Zoro liked going with Luffy. Which was great. Because Luffy liked having Zoro around. Luffy had never met anyone like Zoro before. There wasn't a lot of kids on the island. And the ones that Luffy did know didn't like adventures. They were scared of the jungle and the big animals that ran around in them. Not like Zoro. Sure, Zoro didn't like to go too far from his dad, but Shanks said that's 'cause something bad happened to Zoro a long time ago. Luffy didn't ask what it was because he didn't really care. Bad things happened to lots of people, bad things had happened to him. Zoro didn't like to be too far from his dad, but he still liked to go on adventures. And Zoro didn't talk a lot, but he didn't need to. Luffy heard everything Zoro had to say whenever their eyes met. Zoro had a lot to say. And Luffy loved to listen. Most of all, Luffy loved that he wasn't alone. He'd been alone for a long time. Gramps never came around and Makino and the mayor liked him, but they were caretakers, not friends. Luffy spent so much time wandering around by himself with a big empty hole in his chest. And it was a hole Zoro filled up completely. Luffy wasn't alone anymore. And, he knew with Zoro, he'd never have to be alone again. They made it into town when the sun was high in the sky. It was probably time for lunch. Which meant lots of meat. I bet Makino will make you dash. A sharp and angry hiss cut Luffy off. He turned to look at Zoro, his friend's teeth bared and his hand wrapped around his white sword. Danger. Zoro told him. We're in danger. Luffy spun around to look where Zoro was looking. He blinked in surprise at the large figure walking swiftly toward them. Gramps. Marines. Beckman threw the door open without knocking, his black hair disheveled and eyes wide. Put some FING pants on. A Vice Admiral just pulled up. Every bit of blood in Mihawk's veins froze. Beside him, Shanks scrambled up, rambling about getting the ship ready so they could head out as soon as possible. But Mihawk had no intentions of letting them leave right away. Because, Zoro, he breathed, snatching his clothing. Lucky Roo and Yasop are already out looking for him, Beckman said. Mihawk ignored him, snatching Yoru as soon as he got his pants on and bolting out the door. Shanks chased after him. The overwhelming power of a Vice Admiral shot through him, creeping closer and closer to Zoro. Not again. Mihawk wasn't about to let a Marine traumatize Zoro again. Not after he was finally settling, staring to be confident. The towering figure of Monkey D. Garp stood in front of Zoro, blocking him from leaving the jungle and making his way back into town. Back to Mihawk. Luffy stood between his grandfather and Zoro, shouting insults at the Marine. And Zoro hissed and growled like Mihawk hadn't heard in weeks. Even from a distance, Mihawk could see the spittle flying from Zoro's lips. Garp turned, as though sensing Mihawk the same as he had sensed Garp. The Vice Admiral sneered at him. Mihawk snarled back. Zoro! Shanks called, his concern heavy in his voice. It sent waves of cold through Mihawk's body. Shanks was never concerned. The captain was nothing if not lazily confident in himself and his abilities to protect people. Red hair, Garp growled. Marine hunter. Mihawk glared at the Marine, his fingers brushing against Yoru's hilt. Daddy. Zoro bolted toward him, slamming into Mihawk's leg. The boy scrambled around to press himself against the back of Mihawk's leg, peeking around to hiss at Garp again. Yoru forgotten, Mihawk dropped his hand to rest on Zoro's soft green locks in a silent promise. His son was safe. And Mihawk would see to it that no one put him in harm's way again. "He's coming with me, Dracule," Garp said, taking a step toward them. Mihawk tensed, Yoru roaring with anger at the threat as Mihawk pulled the blade free. Vaguely, he could hear Luffy yelling at Garp about not touching his first mate, but the only thing Mihawk could focus on was the roaring of his furiously beating heart. Over his dead body. Garp would take Zoro over his dead Fing body. Little hands dug into the leg of Mihawk's pants. Behind him, Shanks's aura grew quickly and angrily. The BSTRD was annoying, but Mihawk had to admit there was no one he'd rather have at his back. Especially when there was an angry Vice Admiral determined to take away his son. "Let us pass, Garp," Mihawk told him evenly. "I don't want to kill you in front of your grandson." He'd become fond of Luffy over the past several weeks. The young boy was determined, his resolve rivaling Zoro's, and he'd brought Zoro so much joy. Luffy was impossible not to be fond of. The more time they spent with him, the more Mihawk understood why Shanks had passed on his treasure to Luffy. Why he believed in Luffy. Garp's gaze sharpened. Zoro's grip tightened. "He's a kid, Garp," Shanks said, his voice tight. "It's a weapon. He," Mihawk snarled, "is my son. And should you try to remove him from my care, I will remove you soul from your body. Leave Zoro alone." Luffy shouted, flying at Garp and wrapping himself around the Vice Admiral. "Luffy!" Garp snarled. "Luffy!" Zoro shouted. Mihawk dropped Yoru, snatching the back of Zoro's shirt and yanking him into his arms to keep his son from yelling at Garp as well. "No ouch!" Zoro screamed, trying to wriggle himself free. "No ouch, Luffy!" "Hockey, let's go," Shanks ordered, returning Yoru to the scabbard for him. Despite the confidence in Shanks's tone, Mihawk hesitated. He knew Garp was Luffy's grandfather, but still. Garp had called Zoro it. Like the fact that the world government wanted to use a child as a weapon didn't affect him in the slightest. "Luffy! No ouch! No ouch! Luffy, Daddy! Garp won't hurt him, little hawk," Shanks said. "I promise. We have to go." Zoro fought them the entire way. He screamed for Luffy, his teeth sinking into Mihawk's flesh whenever he could. Blood dripped down Mihawk's arms and chest, but he didn't loosen his hold. "Let's go!" Shanks called as they made it onto the ship. "I don't want Marines destroying this village." "Luffy!" Zoro howled. Zoro cried for days. Nothing Mihawk did would calm him. When he wasn't sleeping, he was crying. It was a fight to get him to drink water. Never, in his life, had Mihawk felt so useless. Zoro. Shanks had far more patience than Mihawk. How he managed to sit beside the boy without flinching away, Mihawk would never know. Zoro hissed at Shanks, tears still streaming down his red face. Shanks sighed. "Luffy is fine, little hawk. I promise." Another, angrier growl. "Dracule Zoro," Mihawk said sharply, patience waning. Zoro hissed at him. Mihawk tried not to let it bother him. It had been years since Zoro had bared his teeth like that in Mihawk's direction. "Zoro," Shanks said, his voice still far more soothing than Mihawk could manage. A strange anger hummed under his skin. It had been building for days and felt like it was for everyone, all at once. At Garp for daring to try and take his son. At Shanks for convincing him to let Zoro wander by himself. At Luffy for being Garp's grandson. At Zoro for wandering out of Mihawk's sight. At himself for letting his guard down. It shook through his entire being, a weaving, howling monstrosity of anger. His chest clenched, heart pounding in his ears as Zoro hissed again, spittle flying past his lips. Biting down every instinct to yell at his son, Mihawk spun on his heel and stormed out of the room. The deck boards squeaked their protest under his feet, Shanks's crew giving him a wide berth as he searched for a place out of the way. It was ridiculous, this mounting burden of frustration and anger that he couldn't shake. Mihawk was meant to control his emotions. They didn't control him. Ever. Why did this anger have such a hold on him? Why was it getting more and more difficult to breathe evenly? The urge to fight was there. To pull Yoru from its place on his back and slice down whatever devil fruit was causing him to lose his grip on his emotions like this. But there was no devil fruit user around. No one to strike down. Had he been hit by a user without his knowledge? Had there been a Marines user hiding in the shadows? Were they hoping to make him lose control of his emotions and act on this incredible wave of anger and uncertainty? His breath echoed in his ears, each louder and heavier than the last. How did he stop this if there was no devil fruit user to cut down? Sea water. The thought hit him at the same time as the salty sea breeze. If he jumped into the sea now, it might cleanse him of this horrible feeling. Mihawk. Beckman's voice floated toward him and Mihawk bit back a curse. The last thing he needed was any of the crew around him, especially when he felt himself spiraling out of control. "Leave," Mihawk ground out. Beckman's feet paused. The tall, older man watched him with a carefully neutral face. Thought you'd want to know. Luffy got your boy calmed down. Calmed down. The words lifted some of the weight on Mihawk's chest. Luffy had gotten Zoro to calm down. That was good. Maybe now he could at least. Luffy? Mihawk sputtered out as his swirling mind finally registered the name and came to a screeching halt. Beckman nodded. Makino called. She had the kid on the other end of the line. He worked his magic pretty quickly. Zoro even stopped trying to bite the captain. Breath came easier, as though this very news was all he needed to defeat the devil fruit. Little Hawk wants you, Beckman continued. Think he's finally back with it enough to understand how he's been acting. Mihawk nodded. The breaths kept coming. I'll be right in. Beckman didn't move for a long moment, just stared at Mihawk like he was a puzzle in desperate need of being put together. Then the older man nodded and turned away before he paused again. Mihawk. Mihawk raised a single eyebrow to signal that he was listening as Beckman turned back around. It wasn't your fault. Mihawk swallowed hard, trying to keep his body from sagging in relief at the words as the overwhelming power of the devil fruit tried to wash over him again. His eyes tried to water but he wouldn't let them. Couldn't let them. Mihawk didn't cry. He hadn't since he was a child. Crying got him nothing and nowhere. I have no idea what you're talking about. Beckman stared more intensely. It wasn't your fault. Mihawk's bottom lip trembled for barely a second before he bit it. Zoro needs to be able to be a child, Beckman continued. He deserves to be a child. He won't always have you with him. No child always has his parents with him. It wasn't your fault. Their eyes remained locked, Beckman clearly waiting for him to say something. But what was there to say? I didn't know it was going to be this hard. The word slipped out without permission. He didn't know it was going to be this hard. This hard to love. To care. To worry. He didn't know it was going to be this hard to have control torn from his hands. He didn't know it was going to be this hard to feel helpless. To be helpless. Nothing good ever comes from easy, Beckman replied. No, Mihawk supposed it didn't. Giving Beckman a solemn nod, Mihawk slipped by him and made his way back to the captain's quarters. He heard Zoro long before he opened the door, his son's soft sniffles and whimpers accompanied by Shanks's soft mumbles. Daddy, Zoro whimpered when Mihawk slipped through the door. His eyes were bloodshot and his cheeks still red and wet from days of crying. The Den Mushi sat on the table beside Shanks's bed, eyes closed as it slept. See? Shanks said, his smile thin and tired but voice light. Told you he'd be right back. Zoro sniffles, leaning out of Shanks's embrace to reach for Mihawk. Daddy. I'm right here, little tiger. Settling himself on the bed, Mihawk found himself with a chest full of Zoro. Daddy. Zoro's voice shook wildly before he burst into tears again. Oops, Daddy. I know, Mihawk whispered. I know it was scary. Oops, oops. Mihawk tightened his grip around Zoro, planting a kiss on the top of his head. It's all right. We're all right. Once Zoro finally settled down, he nestled himself between Mihawk and Shanks, head resting on Mihawk's chest. The ship rocked softly as they sailed onward, back toward the Grand Line. Marines or not, they needed to put distance between themselves and Garp, and Shanks seemed to think a prehistoric island on the early end of the Grand Line was the right direction to take. Daddy. Mihawk's eyes were heavy now that all had finally calmed, and it took him a moment to even respond to Zoro's quiet voice. Shanks was warm and inviting beside him, his arm wrapped around Zoro and resting on Mihawk's stomach. Zoro and Luffy, Daddy and Papa. Brow furrowing, Mihawk turned his head just enough to look down at the determined set of Zoro's jaw. What? Zoro and Luffy, his son repeated, Daddy and Papa. Zoro and Luffy, Shanks mumbled, want to be pirates. Oh? Zoro nodded against Mihawk's chest. Zoro, free. Tightening his grip on Zoro, Mihawk nodded. Zoro, free. I challenge you to a duel. The young man's shout was smug and confident, but then again, they always were. If there was one thing Mihawk hadn't missed in the 4 years he and Zoro had spent hidden from the world, it was ignorant small fries trying to waste his time. Especially when it was Zoro's birthday. Or kidnapping day, as Shanks kept trying to call it. Mihawk tried to veto it, but the rest of the crew seemed all too enthusiastic about it. It sounds more piratey, Hawky, Shanks had told him smugly. Piratey, Zoro had chirped. Mihawk should have known then that allowing them to stop ashore for birthday, kidnapping day, Hawky. Shopping wasn't going to go the way he wanted, but Zoro had been all too enticed by the promise of more swords. Gritting his teeth, Mihawk sent his most withering glare in the man's direction. Once in a while it would work in his favor, sending the opponents running without him needing to engage. Of course, this time it didn't work. The man only glared back. Zoro tugged on his hand. Daddy, sword. Mihawk sighed, giving Zoro a small push toward Shanks. Go on ahead, Tiger. Zoro accepted Shanks's hand and pet his head to the side with curiosity at the man. Quishu? Mihawk hummed. It will only take a moment. Zoro beamed at him. Quishu, Daddy. You want to watch, little hawk? Shanks asked, stooping to scoop Zoro into his arm. Yes. Zoro grinned, his eyes alight with excitement. Mihawk stared. Yes. Not hum. Yes. Biting down on the inside of his lip to keep his own ridiculous grin at bay, Mihawk nodded. All right then. It won't take long. F dash. Mihawk choked on his drink, red wine spraying out his nose in an undignified way he'd rather not think of. The ship around then went deathly quiet. Lucky Roo and Yasopp backed away slowly. Shanks at least had the decency to look nervous, unlike his idiot first mate. Beckman simply leaned down to pick up Watto and offer her back to Zoro with gentle hands. Try again. Try again. As though Zoro hadn't just screamed obscenities at the top of his lungs because he was frustrated. Mihawk lived under no fantasies that Zoro would never hear, or speak, unbecoming language. The crew Mihawk had chosen to let him grow up around wasn't exactly dignified, and he knew Zoro was bound to pick it all up eventually, especially now that he'd actually starting to speak a language everyone could understand. However, that didn't change the fact that Mihawk was in no way ready to hear his son speak like that. Zoro was, not that he could ever articulate it in a dignified enough manner to speak the words out loud, his baby. And Mihawk was in no way ready for him to be old enough to say, F dash. The rest of Shanks's small crew began inching away as Zoro glared down at Watto. Shanks's eyes darted between Mihawk, setting his wine glass down, and Beckman, knelt down to offer Zoro back his sword. I think I left everything in the kitchen on. Lucky Roo stumbled over his own tongue and turned toward the kitchen. I'll help, Yasopp offered, the two of them vanishing into the kitchen. The rest of the crew took it as their sign to scatter. Zoro sniffled as he accepted Watto, cradling his blade as though it were fragile. His earlier frustration simmered into quiet shame and his nervous brown eyes flickered to Mihawk for a moment. You're doing fine, Zoro, Beckman told him. Zoro's knuckles turned as white as the hilt he gripped. Watto no listen. Beckman chuckled, lowering himself to sit cross-legged in front of Zoro. Watto listened fine, Zoro. Did you? Zoro's brow furrowed, nose pinching up in confusion. Mihawk stood frozen, suddenly unsure of what to do. His desire to scold Zoro for his language softened to a weak push against his chest. A sword isn't just about strength, Zoro. It's about trust. You have to trust yourself, then Watto will trust you too. It was good advice. Advice Mihawk would have given his son as well. And Shanks said Zoro needed to learn independence. To learn from others. Zoro stared down at Watto, uncertain in the face of Beckman's patience. TR, Zoro mimicked, staring at Beckman's lips. He'd picked the habit up a few weeks ago, when they'd first crossed into the Grand Line. Whenever someone said a word that he wanted to learn, he would repeat the first syllable and stare at their lips until they repeated it. Hongo assured them it was just the young boy's way of learning new words instead of making up his own. TR. TRIST, Beckman enunciated, slow and careful. It means you believe in something, without a single doubt. Like how you trust your daddy and papa and all of us to protect you. TRIST. TRIST, Zoro elongated the word. Trust. Trust. Trust Zoro. Beckman's face warmed in a smile as he ruffled Zoro's hair. Yes. Trust Zoro. You'll get there, kiddo. You're already tougher than half the crew. Zoro's eyes brightened and his chest puffed out in pride. Strong. Mihawk allowed himself to breathe. Some of the tension in his shoulders loosened and he walked toward them slowly. Beckman looked at him first, face calm and unapologetic. Zoro turned to beam up at him next. Daddy, he greeted with a grin. Zoro strong. Very strong, little tiger, Mihawk agreed, running his fingers through Zoro's messy green locks as he knelt down. He had to look up at Zoro now when he knelt down. God, he'd gotten so big. Mihawk's baby, all grown up. Very strong. And so very frustrated. Zoro, I'd like to teach you something new. Zoro's head ped to the side with curiosity. It's called meditation. It will help make you even stronger. From the corner of his eye, Mihawk watched Beckman smirk and rise to his feet. The approval in the movement made something warm bubble in Mihawk's chest that he refused to acknowledge. He needed no one's approval. Certainly not Shanks's annoying and overzealous first mate. Daddy learn Zoro. Teach, Mihawk corrected gently. I will teach you. TACH. TACH, Zoro echoed. Daddy TCH Zoro. The thick, muggy air of Little Garden carried low rumbles and distant bellows over the ship. Mihawk had heard of the island several times. The land that time forgot, but he'd never had the chance to visit it. The large foliage swayed, rustling in the breeze. Beside him, Zoro vibrated with excitement, his hands knotted in Mihawk's coat tails. "What do you think, little hawk?" Shanks asked, grinning up at them from the island with his arms open wide. "Want to go on an adventure?" ADV, Zoro echoed. "Adventure," Shanks repeated. "Like you and Luffy used to." Advent. Zoro cut himself off with a frustrated growl, his hands tightening and tugging at Mihawk's coat. "Adventure," Mihawk said. "Adventa," Zoro said slowly. "Adventure. Adventure. Adventure. Adventure." Finally, Zoro beamed up at Mihawk, tugging at his coat. "Adventure, Daddy. Adventure." Mihawk failed to bite back his smile. "All right, little tiger. Adventure." Zoro yipped with excitement, already running down the gangplank and straight into Shanks's waiting arms. "Papa. Adventure." Mihawk disembarked with far more measured steps. His boots sunk into the soft, damp soil immediately. The heavy, wet air pressed down on him. The humidity had already started to frizz Zoro's hair and Shanks's red locks were wet with sweat, sticking to his cheeks and forehead as he swung Zoro around. "Big rustles," Zoro said excitedly, clambering onto Shanks's shoulders to point at the trees. "Big rustles." "Huge," Shanks laughed. "The biggest, little hawk." Daddy, biggest rustles." Zoro paused, his brow furrowing for a moment. "Biggest trees. Biggest trees." "Well," Shanks grinned at Mihawk as he made his way to the duo. "You can't say the kid doesn't appreciate nature." Mihawk didn't bother to contain his eye roll. It kept him from smiling at them. "Come here, Zoro," Mihawk said, holding his arms out for the boy. "Before you knock your papa out." Watto was tied to Zoro's back, the scabbard coming dangerous to smacking Shanks repeatedly in the temple. Grinning, Zoro threw himself into Mihawk's arms and the weight almost brought both of them to the ground. He was getting so big. Gone was the little boy that looked like he was barely 3. Zoro wasn't quite the size of an average 9-year-old boy, but he was certainly getting there. The moment Zoro's feet touched the ground, he wandered toward one of the largest trees, staring up with awe-filled eyes. Mihawk wasn't sure what the word was for the warmth that spread through him as he watched Shanks's face soften in a fond smile. The captain's eyes tracked Zoro from tree to tree with a gentleness a man as strong as Shanks had no right wearing. The corner of Shanks's lips pulled up in the smallest of smiles, his hand sliding into his pocket. The pirate was handsome. That had never been up for debate. Shanks was a large man with appealing muscles and a face that brought weaker people to their knees. His eyes were sharp and the scuff starting on his chin only made his jaw look stronger. But, with this look, Shanks was far more than handsome. He was beautiful. The urge to soak in the moment was almost as strong as the urge to yell at Shanks not to look like that. Not to send that strange feeling fluttering through Mihawk's veins. "Come on, little hawk," Shanks called, pulling his hand free of his pocket to offer it to Zoro. "Let's go on an adventure. I have some friends to look for." Grinning, Zoro scrambled back to them, taking Shanks's hand and then snatching one of Mihawk's. "Friends?" Mihawk asked as they started through the forest. His hand swung with Zoro's, the young boy humming a disjointed tune. Briefly, Mihawk wondered where he'd heard it. Not from Shanks or any of the red-haired pirates, as far as he knew, and certainly not from Mihawk. Shanks hummed. "I wanted to check in on them. It's been a while." "Someone lives here? On the land that time forgot?" Shanks smirked at him over Zoro's head. "You lived with human drills. That's far different than living millions of years in the past." The ground beneath them trembled suddenly, vibrations rippling up through the soles of Mihawk's boots. Likely one of the many large creatures that must live on an island like this. Zoro froze, tugging Shanks and Mihawk to a stop as he stared out at the jungle. "Rumbles," he muttered. Shanks hummed. "No worries, little hawk. It's just some big critters." "CRI," Zoro looked up at Shanks expectantly. "CRI." Before Shanks could sound the word out for him again, a colossal creature burst through the trees. Its massive legs snapped branches and flattened the undergrowth as it charged forward. The dinosaur, an enormous carnivore, tilted its head, its beady eyes locking onto Mihawk's son and friend? What was Shanks at this point? They were far more than acquaintances. Acquaintances didn't stay with you for years. They didn't help raise your child. But Shanks wasn't his captain. Mihawk would run himself through before he called Shanks his captain. And, even then, captains typically didn't sleep their crewmates with the same regularity that he and Shanks did. Did they? Now that he thought about it, Mihawk had never been a member of a pirate crew. He'd traveled with some, in his early years, but he'd never truly belonged to one. He'd never known the background goings-on. And that was beside the point. Not captain and crewmate. Not acquaintances. Friends? It didn't feel right. Zoro called Shanks, Papa, for God's sake. That was more than friends. Wasn't it? Zoro's hand left Mihawk's, yanking Mihawk's brain away from the useless discussion. His head snapped down to look at his son. Zoro had dropped into a ready position, his hand wrapping around Watto's hilt, and his lip already pulled back in a snarl. Easy, little hawk, Shanks said gently, resting his hand on Zoro's head. He's not hurting you, is he? Zoro's snarl faded slightly and he stood a little straighter to look up at Shanks. Big, he muttered, his voice a mix of nerves and confusion. Quishu? Do you have a reason to fight? Shanks asked. Zoro's brow furrowed further. You never pull your weapon on something you don't intend to kill, Shanks said, nodding his head toward the dinosaur. Do you need to kill it? No. It was more a question than an answer. What do you think, Hawkie? Shanks asked easily. Well, Mihawk looked down at his son. Can you beat it? Zoro's strong. You are, Mihawk agreed. But do you know your opponent, little tiger? The dinosaur let out a deep, rumbling growl and dipped its head low to sniff the air. Mihawk shifted his weight without reaching for Yoru. He was the backup in this situation, of that he was well aware. Unless Shanks failed to drive the creature away by pure force of will, there was no need to unsheath this sword and worry Zoro. Look at the dinosaur, Mihawk told his son. What do you see? Zoro stared at the dinosaur, studying it with narrowed eyes. Big. Strong. Yes. And? Red? Mihawk didn't miss Shanks's soft huff of laughter at the simple answer. Yes. Very red. Do you think he's quick, like you? Zoro ped his head to the side. Zoro small. Zoro small. CR big. Zoro fast. CRI. CRI slow? I think you're right, Mihawk praised, earning himself a wide grin. Even the strongest opponents have weakness, little tiger. Learn them and win. Zoro grinned. Win. The carnivore had apparently decided their small group, family? Was that what they were? Was Shanks his family? Was nothing of interest. It turned away, the ground trembling beneath them as it stomped away. Zoro let out a small, disappointed noise. No Quishu? Not today, little hawk, Shanks chuckled. Next today? Tomorrow, Mihawk corrected. Tomorrow. Tomorrow. Tomorrow? Shanks chuckled. No, not tomorrow. You've got a bit of growing to do before your daddy'll let you fight something that big, kiddo. Zoro turned to pout up at Mihawk. Zoro strong. Yes, little tiger. You are strong. And you'll get stronger the bigger you get. Now, come along. Still pouting, Zoro ignored the hand Mihawk offered him. Zoro strong. All right, Shanks said, snatching Mihawk's hand for himself. Come on, Hawkie, give the kid a bit of independence. Keep close, Zoro. Yes. Zoro fell in step just behind them as they continued on. Mihawk couldn't keep himself from looking over his shoulder every few steps, trying to ensure Zoro hadn't gotten distracted by any of the large trees or any other number of oddities on the island. He loved that Zoro was growing stronger and braver, but on an island like this, his curiosity may be a double-edged sword. Each time he looked, Zoro was within touching distance. His eyes were wide as he looked around, completely enamored by the island, but he remained close. Breathe, Shanks whispered. Not like the kid has ever gone outside of your eye line for anything other than Luffy. Trust, Hawkie. Trust. The one thing Mihawk had always struggled with. Daddy always said the world talked, Zoro just had to listen. All the big rustles, trees. Daddy said they were called trees and Zoro had to remember that. The men on the other island had laughed at him when he called them rustles. Zoro didn't like being laughed at, even if Daddy had made the men stop laughing just by giving them a mean look, swayed and shimmied. The air was heavy, like when Yop spent too long in the shower and the bathroom got all foggy and warm. It made lots of buzzing sounds he didn't recognize, chirps and rustles and something big roaring from far away. None of these sounds were like the wind when it whispered. They just hung around, telling Zoro they were there, but they didn't pull him anywhere. It was, what would Daddy say? Strang? Maybe that was the word. The tree's long green leaves looked like swords and the ground squelched under his boots. Maybe the trees wanted to quishu with him and the ground wanted him to know it was wet. In front of him, Daddy and Papa talked. He didn't listen to a lot of their words, when he tried to hear them too well, it made his head hurt. And something else whispered. Zoro froze, feeling the tug on his arm. The wind again. It wanted something. Most of the time, when Zoro went where the wind wanted, Daddy told him he was getting lost. But every time he followed the wind, Zoro always found something cool. He liked the wind. And he liked that when he listened to the wind it made other people smile. Like Luffy when he found his friend the beetles. Luffy had been so happy. Zoro wanted to make Daddy and Papa that happy. Holding an arm out, Zoro let the wind wrap around his arm. He followed it, ducking through the thick, tall grass. The wind hummed its approval and continued to tug him. Zoro followed obediently, barely glancing around at the giant trees and smelly flowers. Crack! The ground beneath him crumbled away. Zoro yelped as he dropped, surrounded only by wind for a minute before he hit something hard and tumbled down. Dirt and rocks cut into him until he finally stopped. Watto dug into his back and his whole body burned with fresh cuts. The bright blue of the sky spun above him, the tree swords, leaves, he has to call them leaves, hanging down. His ears rang, like the wind was laughing at him. Ouch, Zoro muttered, sitting himself up to look around. Right in front of him was a big, rocky wall. The ground trembled. Zoro turned. A massive CRI stomped forward. Its legs were thicker than the trees and its big mouth had sharp teeth that twinkled in the sun. Its bright eyes, the same color as the glow, no the sun. They were the same color as the sun, locked on him. Zoro choked, his fingers scrambling for Watto. Moving made his arm hurt but he made his fingers grab Watto anyway. Watto always helped him. Zoro strong, he reminded himself, pulling his sword free. His legs shook as he stood up. The big CRI roared. It was loud and made his whole body tremble. The CRI ran toward him, each step causing Zoro to trip over the wind. He and Daddy were wrong. The CRI was very fast. Zoro swung Watto at it anyway but she bounced off its leg. Zoro didn't see a single ouch on the monster looming above him, its jaws opening. Large, wet drops fell from its mouth. Like rain but they smelled a lot worse. Daddy. The name stuck in his throat. Zoro wanted his daddy and his papa. He wanted someone, anyone, that could stop this big CRI. A deep, booming laugh made the ground quake. Zoro stared up at the sky to see a big axe swing down. The giant CRI yelped and vanished, knocked into the lots of trees away from him. The big man replaced the CRI. Bigger than anything Zoro had ever seen. His beard was longer than a river. Bahaha. Well, hello, little warrior, the big man boomed. The ground rumbled as he fell onto his butt, sitting in front of Zoro. He was still bigger than the ship. Bigger than the Sea King's papa showed him when they crossed over the upside-down stream. It's not often I see such a tiny fighter. Zoro stared up at him, words running around his tongue but not leaving his mouth. Oh, I bet a squirt like you have never seen someone like me, huh? Be big. Big what? What could he possibly call something this big, be big tree? The big man tilted his head to the side, like Papa when he doesn't understand what Zoro's saying. Then he threw his head back and laughed. Big tree? That's a good one. My name's Dory. And you're a brave little sapling. ZZ Zoro, Zoro forced himself to say. Daddy always said if someone said their name, he should say his too. Zoro, Dory echoed. A pleasure, little sapling. But a little sprout like you shouldn't be wandering on his own. Where'd you come from? Zoro swallowed. D-Daddy, Papa. No, Daddy. Lost. Dory's face softened. Well, we can't have that, can we? Don't worry, little sapling. I'll keep you safe until your daddy and Papa find you. Dory held his hand out. Come aboard. You'll be able to spot them better from up with me. Zoro stared at him, keeping a tight hold on Watto. Then the wind returned, ramming into Zoro's back. He stumbled forward, right onto Dory's hand. The big man smiled down at him and then stood. You've got the bravery of a great warrior, Dory said. Warm fuzzies prickled against Zoro's skin as the big man set Zoro on his shoulder. A great warrior. Like Daddy. Or Papa. Or Ben. He liked the sound of it. But all of the bravery he felt vanished when he looked down. The ground was so far away he could barely see it and the trees looked like toys. Closing his eyes, Zoro pressed himself a little closer to Dory's neck. Zoro strong, he reminded himself. Daddy and Papa told him that. He was strong. He was going to keep being strong and brave. Dory laughed, the booming sound shaking the air. But it was a lot less scary than the first time Zoro heard it. And the heart of a giant. Don't worry, little sapling. Stick with me and you'll be just fine.
Okay, sadly the chapter is over. And if you enjoyed the video, just leave a like and subscribe with post notification. So when the next chapter is ready, you will be notified. Okay, see you in the next video. Bye.